Calvin Rourke's thick fingers closed around Martha Boone's wrist before she even saw him coming. He yanked her off the wooden sidewalk in front of the general store and dragged her through the dirt of Main Street like she was nothing more than a sack of flour he'd decided to move from one place to another. Martha stumbled, her boots scraping twin lines through the dust, and she grabbed at his forearm with her free hand, trying to find purchase, trying to slow herself down. He didn't slow. He never slowed for anyone. "You think you can ignore Calvin Rourke?" he said, loud enough for every soul on that street to hear. "A woman your size ought to be grateful somebody's paying her any attention at all." The laughter that followed was worse than the grip on her wrist. If this story of courage and justice moves something in you, please subscribe to our channel so you never miss the stories we bring you. Hit that like button and drop a comment below telling us what city or country you're watching from. We'd love to see how far this story has traveled. Now let's go back to Dry Creek and find out what happened when one man decided enough was enough. The morning had started the way most of Martha Boone's mornings started, with flour on her hands and a list of things she couldn't quite afford running through the back of her mind. She'd been up before the sun, the way she always was, because the bread didn't bake itself, and the families out on the eastern ranches expected their weekly order to be ready when they sent someone into town. Martha had learned, somewhere in the long, difficult years since Thomas died, that the only thing that kept grief from swallowing a person whole was work. So she worked. She worked when her back ached and when her eyes felt like she'd packed sand under the lids, and when the empty side of the bed felt so loud she had to hum to herself just to fill the silence. By 7 in the morning, she had 6 loaves cooling on the rack and 2 shirts half finished for the Hendricks family out on Sycamore Creek. By 8, she'd wrapped the bread in cloth and was carrying it down Main Street toward the general store, where old Abe Tillman would hold it in the back until Roy Hendricks came by to collect it sometime after noon. Dry Creek in the morning had a particular quality to it. The light came in low and sideways off the eastern hills and turned everything a pale gold that made the town look prettier than it actually was. Martha had always noticed that, the way the morning light lied about things. In that light, the cracked paint on the storefronts looked almost charming, and the mud ruts in the street looked almost like they had character. By afternoon, the light went flat and honest, and you could see Dry Creek for exactly what it was, which was a town that had been slowly strangled for the better part of 3 years. She knew who had done the strangling. Everybody did. Knowing and doing something about it were 2 entirely different things. She was 2 storefronts away from Tillman's when she heard Calvin Rourke's voice behind her. "Well, look at that. The widow's making her rounds." She kept walking. She had learned that keeping walking was usually the best response to Calvin Rourke. He was like a dog that chased wheels. If the wheels stopped, things got worse. But he caught up to her faster than she expected, and his hand closed around her wrist from behind so suddenly that she dropped one of the bread parcels. It hit the dust, and she heard the cloth tear, and she thought, absurdly, that Roy Hendricks was going to have to make do with 5 loaves this week. "I said good morning," Calvin told her, like grabbing a woman's arm in public was a normal way to begin a conversation. Martha turned to face him. She had to tilt her head back slightly to do it. Calvin Rourke was well over 6 feet, and built the way men were built when they'd spent years making other people afraid of them. He had a square jaw and pale blue eyes that always seemed slightly amused by whatever they were looking at, and he dressed better than almost anyone else in Dry Creek, which he considered a point of pride and which Martha considered a symptom of where his money was actually coming from. "Let go of my wrist," she said. "I want to talk about that land." "I've told you my answer." "You've told me your answer about 12 times, he agreed almost pleasantly. "I'm starting to think you enjoy saying no." "I enjoy being left alone." The grip tightened. Not enough to be obviously brutal, just enough to remind her that the choice of how hard it could get was his to make. Around them, she was aware of people stopping. A woman with a basket of washing, 2 men outside the barber shop, a boy about 11 years old who'd been sweeping the walk in front of the feed store. They all stopped what they were doing and watched, and not a single one of them took a single step forward. That was what Calvin Rourke had done to Dry Creek. He hadn't just stolen from people. He'd stolen their sense that anything could be done about it. "Thomas left you a piece of land," Calvin said. 22 acres out past Miller's Bluff. "You can't work it. You can barely keep yourself fed with that bakery of yours. I'm offering you a fair price." "You're offering me a third of what it's worth." "It's worth what someone will pay for it. Nobody else is making you an offer." Because nobody else dares make me an offer while you're in the room. Something shifted in his face. The pleasantness didn't disappear exactly. It just moved aside for a moment, like a curtain in a breeze, and behind it she saw something that had no pleasantness in it at all. Martha, he said, and the way he said her name was almost gentle, which made it worse somehow. You don't want to make an enemy out of me. I'm not making anything, she said. I'm just trying to deliver bread. He pulled. Not a yank exactly, but a sustained, deliberate pull that started moving her down the sidewalk, whether her feet were cooperating or not. Martha grabbed at the wooden post outside Tillman's with her free hand and held on, and for a moment they were in a grotesque kind of standoff, her gripping the post and him pulling her arm in the other direction, and the watching townspeople not moving, not speaking, not doing a single useful thing. You're embarrassing yourself, Calvin said, but he didn't mean her. Let go. Sign the deed over. I'll pay you in cash today, and you'll have enough to leave this town and find somewhere to start fresh. Somewhere people don't know you. Somewhere you could maybe... He paused, and the pause was deliberate, and what he said next was said loudly enough for the entire watching street to hear. Somewhere you could maybe find a man who'd have you. Because I'll tell you honestly, Martha, a woman your size dragging around a dead man's debts in a town that's already done with her, that's not much of a life. She heard someone on the sidewalk laugh. She didn't look to see who it was. She kept her eyes on Calvin's face, and she kept her hand on the post, and she made herself breathe slow and steady because she would not, she absolutely would not, let him see her cry on Main Street. The land isn't for sale, she said. Her voice came out level. She was proud of that. He pulled her hand off the post. He did it casually, the way you'd remove a child's grip from something they shouldn't be holding, prying her fingers back one at a time, and then he turned and walked and dragged her with him down the middle of Main Street. Not toward Tillman's, toward the other end of the street, toward the Silver Creek Saloon, which Calvin Rourke owned the same way he owned most things in Dry Creek, by making sure no one else could compete. Martha stumbled. Her heel caught a rut in the road and she went down on one knee in the dirt. And Calvin stopped walking, but he didn't stop pulling, so she was on her knee in the dust of Main Street with his hand locked around her wrist, and the watching faces of her neighbors all around her, and not one of them moving. You can walk, Calvin said, looking down at her, or I can drag you, your choice. This is assault, she said, not because she thought it would help, but because she wanted someone to hear it said plainly. What he is doing right now is assault. Does everyone see that? Nobody answered. She got her feet under her and stood, because the alternative was being dragged on her knees through the dirt, and she had her limits. She was walking, being walked, being steered, toward the saloon's front doors, when she heard a voice she didn't immediately recognize. Take your hand off her. It wasn't loud. That was the strange thing about it. Every other voice she'd heard that morning had either been cruel or silent, and she'd expected that if anyone ever said those words, they'd say them the way men said things when they were trying to perform bravery for an audience. But this voice was quiet, almost conversational, like the man who'd said it was asking Calvin to pass the salt. Calvin stopped walking. He turned slowly, which told Martha that whoever had spoken was someone Calvin felt he could afford to turn slowly toward. The man standing in the street was not particularly tall. He was lean in the way men got lean when they worked outdoors through every season, and he had dark eyes and a straight back, and his hands were hanging loose at his sides. He was wearing a work shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows and a hat that had seen better decades. He was not wearing a gun belt, which struck Martha as either very brave or very stupid. She knew who he was. Most people in the territory knew who Wade Carson was, at least by reputation. He ran a ranch about 8 miles northeast of town, the kind of operation that was modest in size but well managed. And he was known for 2 things, paying his debts on time and not looking for trouble. I wasn't looking for trouble now. He was looking at Calvin Rourke with an expression that Martha could only describe as patient, like a man who had decided to wait something out. Wade Carson, Calvin said. I didn't know you were in town. Rode in this morning. Wade hadn't moved. Take your hand off her. This is a private matter between me and the widow Boone. A private matter conducted in the middle of the street with 30 witnesses. Wade's eyes moved briefly to Martha, taking inventory, she realized, checking where she was hurt, and then went back to Calvin. Let her go, I won't say it again. Calvin made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and something uglier. You are not in a position to be telling me anything, Carson. You ride a borrowed road every time you come through this county. You want to keep riding it? You need to think very carefully about whose business you're making your own. I've thought about it, Wade said. Let her go. Calvin turned his body to fully face Wade. He didn't release Martha's wrist, but his grip shifted slightly, became more about control and less about direction, and she could feel the difference. His other hand drifted toward his side, toward the pistol on his belt. That was when two things happened at almost exactly the same moment. Calvin's hand closed around the grip of his pistol, and Wade Carson moved. He wasn't slow. That was the thing nobody who'd been watching probably expected. He'd been so still, so quiet, that when he moved, it was like watching a different person. He covered the distance between them in 3 long steps, and his hand caught Calvin's wrist before the gun cleared the holster, and he twisted, not violently, but with a mechanical inevitability, like a gear catching, and Calvin's face went briefly white with pain. The gun stayed in the holster. Calvin released Martha's wrist. She stepped back immediately, putting space between herself and both of them, and she saw the bread parcel she'd dropped still sitting in the dust 10 feet away, and thought again, absurdly, about Roy Hendricks's order. The two men were very close together, faces about 8 inches apart, Calvin with his wrist locked in Wade's grip and the pistol pinned in its holster. "This isn't done," Calvin said very quietly. "I know," Wade said, equally quietly. "But she's done. Today. Right now." He held the grip for another 3 seconds, long enough to make the point, and then released it and stepped back and turned to Martha. He bent down and picked up the bread parcel from the dirt. He held it out to her. "You all right?" he asked. She took the bread. Her wrist ached where Calvin had held it. Her knee, where she'd gone down in the dirt, had started to sting. Her throat felt tight in a way she didn't want to examine too closely. "I'm upright," she said. "That's something." He looked at her for a moment with those dark eyes, not assessing her size the way Calvin had, not calculating her weaknesses the way the town always seemed to be doing. Just looking, the way you'd look at a person you were genuinely trying to understand. "Tillman's is that way," he said, nodding his head toward the general store. "I know where Tillman's is." "All right." A pause. "I'll walk with you." She almost told him she didn't need him to. But Calvin was still standing 20 feet away, watching, and 3 of his men had materialized on the saloon's porch without her noticing when they'd arrived, and she thought about the difference between needing something and it being sensible. "Fine," she said. They walked. Behind them she heard Calvin say something to one of his men that she couldn't quite make out, and whatever it was, it made the man laugh. She kept her eyes forward. "Thank you," she said, after they'd made it to the covered walkway in front of Tillman's. "Don't thank me yet," Wade said, which was not the response she'd expected. "Excuse me?" He looked at her, and his expression had something in it she couldn't immediately name. Not pity, not admiration exactly. More like the look of a man who'd just stepped in a river and was only now realizing how deep it was going to be. "What you did back there," he said, holding on to that post, saying it plain, that it was assault, in front of all those people. He shook his head slightly. "Calvin doesn't forget things like that." "I know he doesn't." "You'll need somewhere to stay tonight, somewhere that's not your place." She opened her mouth to argue and closed it again. Because he was right. She knew he was right. The minute Calvin's men stopped watching her on the street, they'd be watching her bakery, and the window above the bakery where she slept was exactly 6 feet off the ground, and the lock on the back door had been broken since before Thomas died. "I don't know you," she said. "No," he agreed, "but you know my reputation. Your reputation is that you pay your debts and stay out of trouble." First part's accurate. He looked back down the street, toward where Calvin was still standing with his men, all of them watching. Second part just changed. She stood there on the walkway outside Tillman's general store and looked at this man she'd exchanged maybe 20 words with in her entire life. This quiet rancher who'd just made a very powerful enemy on her behalf, without apparently spending 5 seconds thinking about whether it was worth it, and she tried to figure out what to do with him. "I have bread to deliver," she finally said. "Then let's deliver it," he said, "and after that we can figure out the rest." The rest. Like it was a simple thing. Like the rest wasn't Calvin Rourke and his 3 men on the porch and whatever instructions he was already giving them about the widow who'd embarrassed him and the rancher who'd stopped him in front of half the town. She delivered the bread. Wade stood outside and waited. He didn't come in and make himself part of the conversation with Abe Tillman, which she appreciated. He just waited on the walkway with his hat pushed back on his head and his hands in his pockets, watching the street with those patient dark eyes. When she came out, she found a young boy, the same 11-year-old she'd seen sweeping in front of the feed store, standing close to Wade and speaking quietly and earnestly about something. Wade was listening with the same patient attention he apparently gave everything, nodding occasionally. And when the boy finished, he said something quietly and put his hand briefly on the kid's shoulder, and the boy went off at a trot back toward the feed store. "What was that about?" Martha asked. "Kid's name is Pete Dunnigan, works for Harper at the feed store." Wade straightened his hat. "He wanted me to know that 2 of Calvin's men went around the back of your building about 5 minutes ago." She felt the cold move through her, the specific cold of finding out something you suspected but hadn't wanted confirmed. How does a feed store boy know which building is mine? Everybody in this town knows which building is yours, Martha. That's the point. He looked at her steadily. You understand now that you can't go back there today. She understood. She'd understood since the moment Calvin had grabbed her wrist, if she was honest with herself. But understanding something and accepting it were different animals. "I have orders due tomorrow," she said. "Sewing orders. The Henderson girls need their dresses by Saturday for the dance." "They'll wait." "They won't. They're 17 and the dance is the most important thing that's happened to them since Martha." His voice was not unkind, but it stopped her. "2 men. Behind your building. This is not about dresses right now." She breathed. She looked down at the dress she was wearing. Flour dusted on the right side, a smear of dirt on the skirt from where she'd gone down on her knee in the street. She thought about the orders in her front room and the records in the cedar chest under her bed and the lock on the back door that didn't catch right. "Okay," she said. He nodded, like that was settled. "My wagon's at the livery," he said. "I'll get it. You walk ahead of me. Don't look like you're waiting for anything. Don't look like you're going anywhere particular. Just walk toward the church end of town, like you're going to visit someone." "And if Calvin's men follow me?" "They might. Walk slow. I'll be there before anything happens." She almost said, "How can you be sure of that?" But she looked at the way he was standing, the economy of it, the way he'd covered those 3 steps between him and Calvin so fast this morning that nobody had time to track it, and she decided that Wade Carson probably had a fairly accurate sense of his own capabilities. She walked. The church end of town was quieter, and by the time she reached the small white fence in front of the church itself, she heard the wagon behind her and turned to see Wade pulling up with 2 horses and a flatbed with some gear in the back. He didn't help her up. He just stopped the wagon and looked at her, and she climbed up on her own, which she appreciated more than if he'd offered. She'd been having men treat her like luggage all morning. They rode out of town heading northeast toward the Carson Ranch, and for the first mile neither of them said anything. The hills came up on both sides and the town fell away behind them, and the road turned from packed dirt to something rougher, and the wagon bumped and swayed, and Martha held the side rail and watched the land open up around them. "Why?" she finally said. He kept his eyes on the road. "Why what?" "You don't know me. Thomas and you were barely acquaintances. You had nothing to gain from stepping in back there, and now you've got Calvin Rourke watching your back the same way he's watching mine." A pause. The wagon hit a rut and rocked hard to one side, and both of them grabbed for the rail without thinking, and then the road leveled out. "I've watched what he's done to this town for 2 years, Wade said. "Watched people I respect lose land their fathers broke their backs to build. Watched families pack up and leave in the middle of winter because they had no other choice. Watched that saloon get bigger every year and wondered where the money was coming from." He looked at her briefly. "You're the 4th person this year he's grabbed at on a public street. The other 3 times, everybody looked away and it got worse afterward. And you couldn't look away." "I looked away the other 3 times, he said flatly. "I'm not going to tell you I'm some kind of hero. I looked away and I told myself it wasn't my business, and then I went home and didn't sleep well for a week." He returned his eyes to the road. "Enough of that." There was something in the plainness of it that got past her defenses. She'd expected something more polished, some explanation of principle or honor. The admission that he'd looked away before, that he'd had his own cowardice to reckon with, felt more honest than anything she'd heard from a man in a long time. "He'll come after you," she said. "Probably. He'll make it about the land. He'll claim you've been encroaching on grazing rights or some such thing, and he'll have Teller at the land office back him up, and he'll make trouble for your operation. Wade glanced at her. You know an awful lot about how he works. She was quiet for a moment. The road curved between two stands of pine, and the light went briefly green and cool before opening up again into full sun. Thomas knew how he worked, she said. Thomas was careful about keeping track of things. Records. Numbers. She stopped. What kind of records? She looked at her hands in her lap. Her wrist had gone from aching to a dull purple bruise. She could see it developing even now. She thought about the cedar chest under the bed she couldn't go back to. She thought about Thomas spending his evenings at the kitchen table with his ledgers, the lamplight on his bent head, the way he'd told her once, just once, that he was keeping track of something he wasn't sure what to do about. I need to go back to my place, she said. I just told you it's not safe. Not right now, not today, but soon. There's something there I can't leave. Wade looked at her with that patient, waiting expression. Thomas worked as an accountant, she said, unofficially. People trusted him with their books because he was honest and he was quiet about it. Calvin Rourke trusted him too, for a while. She stopped again, because this was the part she hadn't said out loud to anyone, not since the day she found what Thomas had left in the chest. He kept records. Of everything. What came in and where it went. And some of the places it went, she shook her head. The money didn't go where Calvin said it went. The wagon had slowed. She realized Wade had eased back on the horses without apparently thinking about it. What money? He asked. Relief money, she said. There was a fund, set up the year of the drought, 2 years ago, when half the ranchers in the territory were going under. The territorial government sent money down to be distributed to struggling families. Calvin Rourke was on the committee. I know about the fund, Wade said, and his voice had gone very quiet. I know about it because I applied for relief that year and was told there wasn't enough to go around. Hank Mercer told me the same thing. So did the Kowalski family. We all accepted it because times were hard everywhere. There was money, Martha said. Thomas tracked it. There was enough money for everyone who applied, and then some. The wagon stopped, not gradually. Wade pulled up the horses, and the wagon stopped, and he turned and looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read, because it was too many things at once. How much? He said. I don't know the exact figure. I haven't been able to go through everything carefully, but Thomas's notes reference numbers that... She made herself say it. Wade, if the numbers are right, Calvin Rourke has been stealing from widows and ranchers and orphaned children for at least 3 years. And the land grab, the ranches he's been acquiring, the debts he's been calling in, I think he knows the railroad is coming. The wind moved through the pines beside the road. Somewhere up the hill, a hawk made one long cry and went quiet. The railroad survey, Wade said slowly. I've seen the route maps. Thomas had copies somehow. The line comes through the valley northeast of town. That's where Calvin's been buying up land. That's where he's been forcing people off their claims. She looked at him directly. He's not just stealing money, Wade. He's positioning himself to own every piece of ground the railroad will need when it comes through. Wade sat very still. He was the kind of man who went still when he was thinking hard. She was learning. Not rigid, just settled, like a tree that had put roots down. If that's true, he said, and if Thomas documented it, it's documented. That's what's in the chest. Then it's not just Calvin going to jail for extortion, Wade said. It's every land deal he's forced in the last 3 years being void, every deed being returned. He looked at her. That's why he wants your land. Thomas's land is on the northeast quarter, she said, right in the middle of the projected route. Another silence. You've been walking around this town, Wade said, carrying that knowledge by yourself for how long since Thomas died? 7 months. 7 months. He said it the way a man says something he's trying to make real in his mind. I didn't know what to do with it, she said, and she was surprised by how steady her voice was, because saying it out loud to another person was different from carrying it alone, and the difference was making her chest ache in a way that had nothing to do with her wrist. I'm a baker. I make bread, and I sew clothes, and I'm the woman the whole town laughs at because of how I look. And I had a chest full of documents that could destroy the most powerful man in the territory, and I couldn't figure out who to trust. You couldn't figure out who Calvin hadn't already gotten to, Wade said. Yes. He held her gaze for a long moment. "Can you trust me?" he asked. Not rhetorically. He asked it the way you'd ask a real question, like he understood that her answer required her to make a calculation based on available evidence, and he was willing to wait while she made it. She thought about it. She thought about the way he'd covered those 3 steps in the street this morning, the way he'd held the grip on Calvin's wrist just long enough and then released it, the way he'd sent her on ahead and gotten the wagon and come for her with no drama and no conditions, the way he'd said, flat and plain, that he'd looked away before and wasn't going to anymore. "I think so," she said. "I think I can." He picked up the reins. "Then we need to get to the ranch, and you need to tell me everything you know, and then we need to figure out how to get into your place and get that chest before Calvin figures out what he's actually looking for." The wagon started moving again, northeast, toward the hills and the ranch and whatever came next. Martha looked back once at the road behind them, empty and gold in the afternoon light, and then she turned forward and kept her eyes on what was ahead. The chest was real. The documents were real. Thomas had spent 2 years of quiet, careful evenings building the kind of evidence that could end this, and he died without knowing what to do with it, and now it was sitting under a bed in a building with a broken lock while Calvin Rourke's men walked around the outside of it. She was not going to let it stay there. Wade Carson had made himself an enemy of the most dangerous man in Dry Creek to pull her out of the dirt on Main Street. The least she could do was tell him what she knew. She straightened her back and looked at the road ahead. There was a lot to tell. The Carson Ranch came into view just as the afternoon light started going amber, and Martha's first thought was that it looked like a place where someone had meant to do more work on it than they'd ever gotten around to. The main house was solid enough, 2 stories of timber and stone with a covered porch across the front. But the fence along the south pasture had a section that needed replacing, and the barn door hung slightly crooked on its upper hinge, and there were fence posts waiting to be set in a line along the eastern edge that had been waiting long enough for weeds to grow up around the base of each one. It wasn't neglected exactly. It was the property of a man who worked hard at what mattered most and let the rest slide until he had time to get to it. Martha understood that kind of place. She'd lived in one. Wade pulled the wagon up to the barn without ceremony and climbed down and began unhitching the horses, and Martha climbed down on her own side without waiting to be helped and looked around the yard. A dog came around the corner of the barn, old, brown, moving slowly in the way of a dog that had decided its working years were behind it, and sniffed at her boots and then went back to lie down in a patch of sun. "That's Frank," Wade said, not looking up from the harness buckle he was working. "Frank," she repeated. "He had a different name when I got him, but he never answered to it, so I started calling him Frank, and that took." She almost smiled. Almost. Inside the house, it was cleaner than she'd expected. Not tidy. There were boots by the door and a jacket over the back of a chair and a stack of papers on the table that clearly hadn't been sorted in some time. But clean, the kind of clean that came from a man who understood the difference between clutter and dirt, even if he wasn't always fighting the clutter. There was a wood stove in the kitchen corner and a pump at the sink and 2 windows that looked out over the south pasture, and the late afternoon came through both of them in long golden bars. Wade put water on without asking if she wanted any, and then stood at the counter with his arms crossed, watching her in that patient way he had. "Sit down," he said. "Your knee." She'd forgotten about her knee. She looked down and saw that the dirt stain on her skirt had a darker center where it had bled through without her noticing, and when she bent the knee, she felt it pull in a way she hadn't been paying attention to. "It's fine," she said. "Sit down anyway." She sat at the kitchen table, partly because the knee did hurt more than she'd admitted, and partly because she was more tired than she'd realized, and partly because she'd been holding herself very straight and very correct all day, and it was exhausting. Wade brought a cloth and a basin of water without making it a production, set them on the table, and left her to manage it herself. She appreciated that too. The last thing she wanted right now was someone handling her like she was fragile. She cleaned the knee. It wasn't bad. A scrape, some bruising. Nothing that needed more than air and time. She looked at the bruise on her wrist, which had gone properly purple now, and pressed it once with 2 fingers to establish how much it hurt, which was more than she'd have liked, and then stopped pressing it. "Tell me about Thomas," Wade said. He was sitting across from her now with 2 cups of coffee, black, and he'd pushed one across to her. How he ended up with Calvin's books. She wrapped her hands around the cup. Calvin had an arrangement with Thomas the same way people in town did. He came to him for quiet accounting work. Calvin fancied himself a businessman, said he wanted someone who could read a ledger without making noise about it. She paused. Thomas was good at not making noise. That was one of his qualities. When did he figure out what he was looking at? He never told me directly. You have to understand Thomas. He didn't talk about problems until he had a plan for them. He didn't come home and say, I think I found something terrible, and then we'd discuss it together. That wasn't how he was built. She looked at the cup. He got quieter. About a year before he died, he got quieter, and he started staying up later. And sometimes I'd wake up at 2 in the morning, and he'd be at that kitchen table with the lamp on, and the ledgers spread out, and when I asked him what he was doing, he'd say, just checking some figures. And I knew he was lying, but I didn't push it. Why not? Because I thought it was bank trouble. I thought he'd found a problem with our own accounts and was too proud to tell me. I thought... She stopped. I thought a lot of wrong things, it turns out. Wade drank his coffee. He didn't say anything sympathetic or useless. He died in February, she said. You know that part. The cold hit early that year, and it hit hard, and his chest was never right, even before that winter. He lasted 2 weeks after he took sick. She said it plain because there was no other way to say it, and she'd had 7 months to practice saying it plain. After he was gone, I was going through his things to figure out what we owed and what we had, and I found the chest under the bed, cedar, small, the kind you'd keep good linens in, locked. You didn't know about it? I found the key in his coat pocket, the coat he'd been wearing all winter. When I opened the chest, there was a letter on top. To me. He dated it 6 weeks before he died. Wade said nothing. He was watching her the way he watched everything, waiting, letting her find the pace. He said he'd found evidence of significant financial irregularities in Calvin Rourke's records, she said. That's the language he used, significant financial irregularities. Thomas was always precise. He said he had documentation of funds diverted from the Territorial Relief Program, loans structured to ensure default, and what he described as a systematic pattern of acquiring properties through manufactured debt. She paused. He also said he'd been trying to figure out who to take it to, and he hadn't found the answer yet. He told me to keep it safe. He told me not to trust anyone connected to Rourke, and to assume that connection might go further than I thought. Another pause. He also told me to use my own judgment, because he trusted my judgment more than his own sometimes, which I didn't know until I read it in a letter I had to open because he was gone. The kitchen was quiet. Somewhere outside, a horse moved in this paddock, and the fence creaked. He sounds like a decent man, Wade said. He was, she said. He was a decent, quiet, careful man, and he found something that got too big for him, and he spent his last winter trying to figure out what to do about it, and the cold took him before he could. She set down the coffee cup. I'm not going to let it sit in a chest under a bed. I told myself that the day I read that letter. I just didn't know how to act on it. Until today, Wade said. Until today. When Calvin made his move and you made yours, and now here we are. She looked at him. I need to get back into my place. The chest is the thing. Without the chest, there's nothing. It's just a widow making accusations against the most powerful man in the county. And with it? With it, we have years of records. Thomas was meticulous. He cross-referenced everything. Calvin's books against the territorial relief records, the relief records against the applications, the land transfers against the original deed filings. He traced every dollar. And then there's the railroad maps. She straightened. Wade, those maps are what make this dangerous, because they show what Calvin is planning, not just what he's done. They show that every ranch he's acquired in the last 18 months sits on or adjacent to the projected rail corridor. He's not just a thief. He's positioning himself to be the single largest landowner in the path of the railroad, and he's using stolen money to do it. Wade was quiet for a long moment. How did Thomas get those maps? I don't know. The letter didn't say. She paused. I think someone in the surveying office gave them to him. Thomas knew a lot of people and people trusted him, but I can't be sure. If Calvin knows Thomas had them, he might. He might have known Thomas was getting too close, and the timing of... She stopped herself. No, I'm not going to do that. Thomas died of a chest cold. Men die of chest colds. I'm not going to build a story around it that I can't prove, because that's not how we win this. Wade looked at her with something that was almost surprise. That's very precise thinking, he said. It's the only kind of thinking that will work, she said. We can't go to anyone with suspicion. We go with documentation, or we don't go at all. He nodded slowly. All right. We need to get into your place. Not tonight, she said. Tonight Calvin's men will expect that. They'll be watching. She thought for a moment, her hands flat on the table. Saturday is his gambling night. The saloon runs card games from 8 until past midnight, and every hard man in his employ is there either playing or watching the door. The town is full and loud and nobody's watching alleys. Say is 2 days from now. 2 days to plan properly, she said. 2 days to figure out what we need and how we get out without being seen. Wade turned his coffee cup in a slow circle on the table. You can stay here. There's a second bedroom. My sister used it when she was here last winter. It's not much, but it's clean. People will talk, she said. People are already talking, he said. Calvin made sure of that when he dragged you down the middle of Main Street. That was true. She'd lost the use of public opinion about 4 hours ago. All right, she said. She slept that night in a narrow bed with a quilt that smelled of cedar and something else she couldn't identify, something dry and faintly sweet, and she slept deeper and longer than she had in months, which surprised her when she woke in the gray pre-dawn and worked out that she'd been unconscious for nearly 8 hours. She lay still for a moment, listening to the ranch wake up, the horses moving, a door somewhere, Wade's boots on the floor below, and she thought about Thomas and the chest and what the next 2 days needed to look like. Then she got up, because lying still had never helped anything. She found the kitchen already warm and coffee already made, and Wade was at the table with a map spread across it, which he'd weighted at the corners with a tin cup, a boot knife, a small rock, and what appeared to be a tin of sardines. I've been thinking about the layout, he said, without looking up. Good morning to you too, she said. He looked up. Good morning. He looked back down at the map. Your building. You're above the bakery. 1 room above the shop. She poured coffee and came to stand beside the table. Back stairs from the alley. The alley connects to Miller's Lane on the south end and comes out behind the livery on the north. Calvin's men will watch the front, Wade said, and probably one on the back stairs. Probably. She studied the map. It was a rough hand-drawn thing, more schematic than precise, but he'd gotten the basic layout of Dry Creek's back streets better than she'd expected. The grain merchant next door, Kessler, he's away this week. His wife mentioned it at the well on Thursday. Went to his brother's place in Alton for the week. Wade looked up at her. Kessler's building shares a wall with yours. His storeroom shares a wall with my storeroom. There's a gap in the foundation on the south side where the mortar cracked out 2 winters ago. Thomas and I always meant to fill it. We never filled it. How big a gap? She considered. Enough. He studied her for a moment. Enough, he repeated. It's low to the ground. You'd have to go through sideways and it's not dignified. She held his gaze. I know how I look, Wade. I know what you're calculating. I'm calculating whether we need a pry bar, he said. She blinked. The mortar's old, he said. If the gap is close but not quite, old mortar comes out easier than you'd think with the right tool. I'm not calculating anything else. She felt her face do something she couldn't entirely control for a moment, and she looked back down at the map until it passed. We'll need a pry bar then, she said. Small one. I have 3. They spent the morning going through it. Wade was a thorough planner. Not cautious in the timid sense, but methodical, the kind of man who liked to understand exactly what he was walking into before he walked into it. He asked questions about the chest's weight, the lock type, how many steps from the gap in the foundation to the back stairs to her room above. He asked about which floorboards creaked and where, which she knew precisely because the one by the window had woken her up twice in the last year when she'd gotten up for water in the night, and it had sounded like a gunshot in the dark. He didn't ask her to stay behind. She noticed that and filed it away. In the afternoon, a rider came up the road to the ranch. Martha was in the kitchen going through Thomas's notes from memory, trying to reconstruct on paper what she couldn't reach, when she heard the horse and looked out the window and felt her stomach drop. It was Roy Hendricks, which was a relief, but Roy Hendricks looked like a man who'd been moving fast and was frightened, which was not a relief. Wade met him in the yard. Martha came to the porch door and stood just inside it. They went into her place last night, Roy was saying, his hat in his hands, turning it by the brim. Busted the back lock clean off. Nobody stopped them. Sutter saw it from across the alley and didn't say a word. This morning I went by and the door's standing half open, and it looks like they went through pretty thoroughly. Martha's hands, she noticed, had gripped the door frame. Did they take anything? Wade asked. Nothing obvious from what Sutter could see through the window. They were looking for something specific, I think. The way it looked, they went through drawers, upended things, but they didn't take the cash tin that was sitting right on the shelf, and they didn't take her sewing equipment. Roy looked at his hat. They know what they want. They just didn't find it. Because it's still there, Wade said. Roy looked up at him. Then he looked at the porch door where Martha was standing, and something moved across his face. Guilt, she thought, or the beginning of it. Martha, Roy said. I'm sorry I didn't... He stopped. Started again. On the street yesterday. I was there. I saw what Calvin did and I didn't... I know, she said. That's not right. I should have... Roy. She kept her voice level. What's done is done. Right now I need to know if they left anyone watching the building. Roy blinked at the shift. One man, sitting outside the feed store across the way, been there since this morning. So they knew the chest was there. Or suspected it. They'd torn through her place and not found it, because the cedar chest was under the bed and had blankets over it, and a man searching in the dark looking for documents might reasonably look at drawers and shelves and miss a chest that looked like it was storing winter linens. But they'd be back. Saturday's too long, she said, and came off the porch and into the yard. Both men looked at her. If they suspect the chest is there, they'll go back tonight with better light, or they'll move the whole bed, or they'll... She shook her head. We go tonight, before they expect it. Martha, Wade started. The plan still works. Everything we figured out this morning still works. We go through Kessler's building tonight. We go through the gap. We get the chest. We're out before anyone is the wiser. She looked at him. The gambling night is cover, not the only option. Calvin's men will be at the saloon tonight, same as any night. The man outside the feed store will either be there all night or he'll be rotated. Either way, it's just one man in front of a building, and we're going in through the foundation. Wade looked at her for a long moment. You planned this out just now, he said, standing in the doorway. I've been planning it since Roy said they didn't find what they were looking for, she said. Because if they didn't find it, they'll go back. Tonight is better than waiting. Roy Hendricks was looking back and forth between them with the expression of a man trying to figure out which kind of insanity he'd ridden into. I could help, Roy said. I owe you that much. I need someone who can be seen in a normal place doing a normal thing tonight, Martha said, not unkindly. If we're going through the back, I need people in the front. People who make it look like the street is just the street. Can you do that? Can you be at the saloon tonight for an hour and make sure Calvin's main men are visible? Roy looked relieved to have a task that didn't involve going through foundation walls. I can do that. Don't make it obvious. Just be there. Play a hand of cards. If any of Calvin's men leave the saloon in the first hour after dark, find a way to get word to Wade. How? Pete Dunnigan, Wade said. The Dunnigan boy from the feed store. Pete's 12 years old, Roy said, not disapprovingly, just noting the fact. Pete's 12 years old and he knew the layout of Calvin Rourke's movements better than either of us did this morning, Martha said. He can carry a message from the saloon to the back of Kessler's building in 4 minutes if he runs. Roy settled his hat back on his head with the deliberateness of a man accepting a situation. All right, he said. All right, tonight. After Roy rode back down the road, Wade stood in the yard for a moment looking at the empty track. You trust him? He asked. As much as I trust anyone in that town who's not you, she said. Which is to say, moderately, and not with anything I can't afford to lose. She paused. He came out here. He didn't have to do that. No, Wade agreed. He didn't. They spent the rest of the afternoon going through the plan until it was as solid as they could make it, which was not nearly as solid as Martha would have liked, because no plan that depended on foundation gaps and 12-year-old messengers, and a man playing cards he didn't want to play was ever going to feel solid. But it was what they had, and Martha had learned in the last 7 months that you worked with what you had or you didn't work at all. She made dinner. She hadn't meant to. It was Wade's kitchen, and she was a guest of sorts. But she found herself at the stove because standing still was worse, and there was salt pork and dried beans and enough onion to do something with, and cooking was the thing her hands knew how to do when her mind was somewhere else. Wade came in partway through and watched her for a moment from the doorway. "You don't have to do that," he said. "I'm aware," she said. "Sit down." He sat. She cooked. The kitchen smelled like something other than coffee for the first time since she'd arrived, and it was such an ordinary smell, such a specific smell of regular human life continuing in spite of everything, that she had to focus very hard on the pan for a moment. "Tell me about the railroad maps," Wade said. "Specifically, which ranches?" She told him. She'd memorized the key details because she was the kind of person who memorized things that mattered, and she went through them while she cooked. Which families, which parcels, which of the land transfers had happened in the last 18 months versus earlier. Wade listened without interrupting, and once or twice he said the name of a family she mentioned with a particular flatness that told her he knew them, and the telling landed harder than abstract information. "Hank Mercer," he said, when she mentioned the name. "Parcel on the Northeast Ridge. Thomas's notes show a debt of $400 being called in by Calvin's bank, and when Hank couldn't pay, the land transferred." She paused. "Was Hank a friend of yours?" "Hank packed up his family in December," Wade said. 4 kids. He said he had nothing left." He was quiet for a moment. He looked like a man who'd had the floor pulled out from under him. "I told him I was sorry. I didn't know what else to tell him." "Now you know it wasn't his fault," she said. "The debt was manufactured. The records show it. That won't give him his land back." "It might," she said, "if we do this right. If we get the records to the right people, the Territorial Land Office can review every transfer Calvin engineered. Debts that were fraudulent, the transfers get reversed." "That's a significant if," Wade said. "Everything about this is a significant if," she said. "But it's possible. Thomas built the record specifically so it would be usable. He knew what a court would need." She divided the food into 2 bowls and brought them to the table and sat down. He was planning to do something with it. He just ran out of time. They ate in a silence that was, she realized, not uncomfortable. It was the silence of 2 people who had run out of small things to say and were sitting with the large things instead, and there was something almost restful about it. "I'm going to ask you something," Wade said, after a while, "and I want you to answer it straight." "I usually do," she said. "When this is over, assuming we get the chest, assuming we find someone to take the evidence, assuming Calvin gets held to account for it, what do you want? What does it look like for you?" She looked at him. It was a strange question, or maybe not a strange question, but one she hadn't expected, because most people, when they looked at her situation, were thinking about what needed to happen and not about what she might want from it. "I want to open the bakery," she said, "properly. Not just bread deliveries and sewing orders, an actual place where people can come." She stopped, because it sounded small when she said it out loud, given everything. "I know it doesn't sound small," Wade said. "Don't apologize for it." She looked at him. "I want the land back," she said, "Thomas's land. Not because I plan to work it. I don't have the people for that, but because Calvin tried to take it, and I'm not giving it to him." A pause. "And I want Hank Mercer's family to be able to come home, and the Kowalskis, and every other family that got pushed off ground they'd worked for years." She looked at her bowl. "That's a lot of wants." "It's the right number," Wade said. She looked up at him, and he was watching her with that expression she was starting to recognize. Not pity, not calculation, something quieter and more considered than either. She held his gaze for a moment and then looked away, because there were things she wasn't ready to think about yet, and that expression of his was one of them. They left for town 2 hours after dark. Wade drove the wagon to within half a mile of Dry Creek, and then they went on foot, keeping to the eastern edge of the road where the tree line gave shadow. The night was clear and cold, the kind of cold that came in mid-autumn when the day's warmth left fast after sunset. And Martha was glad of the heavier coat she'd borrowed from the peg by Wade's door without asking. The town was quiet in the way frontier towns went quiet. Not empty, but gathered in. Light from the saloon spread yellow across the street at the far end. Music and voices drifted out of it, muffled and steady. The sound of an establishment operating at normal capacity. Good. They came in from the south end through the alley behind the church and moved along the back of the buildings without speaking. Martha's knee pulled when she had to step over something in the dark, but she didn't slow. Kessler's back door was unlocked, which was fortunate, or possibly which Wade had anticipated because he didn't look surprised when the latch turned cleanly. Inside, the grain store was dark and smelled of burlap and dust and the particular dry heaviness of stored feed. They moved through it slowly, feeling the way, until they reached the south wall where the storeroom opened. Wade had brought a small lantern, shuttered, and he opened it just enough to let a thin bar of light across the floor. The gap in the foundation was low, lower than Martha had remembered it, which meant worse in practice than in theory. But the mortar around the edges was old and soft, and Wade worked at it quietly with the small pry bar for less time than she'd expected before it gave another 3 inches. She went through first because she knew the layout on the other side, and he didn't. It was undignified, the way all necessary things sometimes were. Sideways, slow, the rough stone edge catching on the coat, and then she was through and in her own storeroom, and she stood up and pressed her palms against her thighs and breathed. Wade came through after her, faster because his shoulders were narrower than she'd expected for a man of his frame, and then they were both standing in the dark of her storeroom, and she could feel the familiar, specific air of the place she'd lived in for 6 years, and it felt like standing in a room that had been ransacked and put back wrong. She found the back stairs by memory. Third step from the bottom creaked, she knew that, so she stepped over it. Wade followed, doing the same without being told because he'd been paying attention when she described it. Her room was cold and disordered in a way that made her jaw tight. They'd turned the mattress. They'd opened the wardrobe and pulled things out. They'd gone through the small desk in the corner and left the drawers pulled out at angles. But the cedar chest was under the bed, under the blankets, and it was exactly where she'd left it. She pulled it out. It was heavier than it looked, which was Thomas's way. The man had never done anything lightly. She tried the lock from habit, and it was locked, which meant they either hadn't found it or hadn't been able to open it without the key. The key was on a cord around her neck, where it had been since the morning after she'd read the letter. She lifted the chest. Wade moved to take it from her, and she shook her head and he stopped and stepped back. She carried it to the stairs herself. They were back through the gap in Kessler's foundation in less time than it had taken to go through it the first time, because when you know what you're doing, a thing gets easier. Out the back door of the grain store, through the alley, into the shadow of the tree line, and then the half-mile back to where the wagon waited in the dark. Martha set the chest in the wagon bed herself, and then stood there with her hand on it for a moment, feeling the cedar under her palm. Thomas had built this record alone in a cold kitchen in the middle of the night. He'd put it in a locked chest and written her a letter and trusted her to know what to do with it, and she hadn't known. For 7 months she hadn't known, but she was beginning to. "You all right?" Wade said beside her. "Not for the first time." "I'm upright," she said. Not for the first time. She felt him almost smile in the dark, though she couldn't see his face, and then they climbed up on the wagon, and he turned the horses south, and they went back to the ranch with the chest and everything Thomas had built. And behind them, Dry Creek sat quiet under a cold sky with its saloon lights on, and Calvin Rourke inside it, not yet knowing what had just walked out of his reach. The chest sat open on Wade's kitchen table for the first time since Martha had unlocked it 7 months ago, and what came out of it looked, on the surface, like nothing more than a dead man's careful paperwork. Ledger pages, handwritten tables, columns of numbers in Thomas Boone's precise, slightly slanted hand, the figures small and exact, the kind of writing that belonged to a man who had learned early that carelessness with numbers had consequences. There were letters folded and refolded until the creases had gone soft. There were copies of land transfer filings, the official territorial forms, some with seals and some without. There were 2 maps, hand-drawn on heavy paper, with the projected railroad corridor marked in red pencil in a line that moved through the valley northeast of Dry Creek like a slow, inevitable tide. And underneath all of it, at the very bottom of the chest, there was a second letter from Thomas that Martha had read once, the morning she found it, and not opened again since. She left that one where it was. Wade pulled up a second chair, and they sat together at the table and went through it. Martha had prepared herself for this. She thought she had. But going through it with another person was different from the night she'd sat alone in the lamplight, reading Thomas's careful documentation of a man's systematic cruelty. With another person, she had to say things out loud. She had to translate Thomas's accounting shorthand and explain what the figures meant, and watch someone else's face do what faces did when they understood what they were looking at. Wade's face didn't do much. That was one of his qualities. He read, and he listened to her explanations, and occasionally he pointed to something and said, "Tell me what that means," and she told him, and he nodded and went on. But after about 40 minutes, he stopped. He put his finger on a particular column in one of the ledgers, the one Thomas had labeled simply RF at the top, which Martha knew stood for Relief Fund, and he sat there with his finger on the number at the bottom of that column for long enough that she stopped talking and waited. "Say that figure again," he said. $11,400, she said. "Over 3 years. That's the total diverted from the Relief Fund, according to Thomas's reconciliation against the territorial records." Wade took his finger off the number. He leaned back in the chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. $11,000, he said. "Give or take." Thomas was conservative in his estimates. He said so in his notes. He only counted what he could directly trace. The real number might be higher. "That's not one man getting greedy," Wade said. "That's not someone skimming from the till because they can." He looked at her. "That's a plan." "Yes," she said. He knew the railroad was coming before anyone else did. At least 2 years before the official announcement, possibly 3. So he diverted relief money to build his land position, then used debt manipulation to push off anyone he couldn't buy outright. And the whole time he's sitting in that saloon acting like a man who built something legitimate. Wade shook his head, not in admiration, just in the particular way a person shook their head at the scale of something. "And tell her at the land office. Thomas has 3 instances where a land transfer was recorded with a filing date that doesn't match the notarization date," Martha said. "In all 3 cases, the discrepancy benefits Calvin. In 2 of those cases, the property owner later said they hadn't agreed to the final terms." She pulled one of the folded letters from the pile. "This is from Dora Whitfield." Thomas wrote down what she told him, word for word. She signed a paper thinking it was a loan extension. It was a deed transfer. Wade read it. He read it slowly. "Dora Whitfield is 63 years old," he said. "She's been living with her daughter's family in Hayes since spring, because she had nowhere else to go." He folded the letter back along its original creases and set it down. He set it down carefully, the way you set down something you want to treat with respect. "Who do we take this to?" he said. That was the question Martha had been sitting with for 7 months. She'd turned it every direction she could think of, and she still didn't have a clean answer. "Not Sheriff Baines," she said. Thomas's notes mentioned Baines twice in connection with Calvin's operation, once receiving payment, once present at a meeting that had no legitimate reason for the sheriff to attend. "I didn't think Baines," Wade said, "but I wanted to hear you say it. The Territorial Land Office is compromised. Teller's involvement makes that plain. The county judge—" She paused. "I don't know about the judge. Thomas doesn't mention him, which could mean he's clean or could mean he was careful enough not to leave a record. Judge Harmon has held that seat for 11 years, Wade said. "I've seen him in the saloon twice in those 11 years, both times for a single drink, and he left before the card game started. That's not definitive, but it's something." "He's in Clearfield," Martha said. Clearfield was the county seat, 40 miles north. "Yes. If we ride to Clearfield and take this to him and he's in Calvin's pocket, Calvin knows everything we have before we can do anything with it. And if we don't take it anywhere, Calvin searches your place more thoroughly, figures out the chest is gone, and knows we have it." Wade looked at the table. "We're already in the water, Martha. The question is just which direction we swim." That was true. That had been true since the moment he'd grabbed Calvin's wrist on Main Street, and probably before that. "There's a federal land commissioner's office," she said, "in the territorial capital. If we bypass the county entirely, the capital is 4 days by stage, 3 hard days on horseback." Wade was quiet for a moment. "And we'd have to leave. Both of us. Which leaves the ranch unguarded and leaves every family in this valley with no warning of what might happen while we're gone." She hadn't thought about the ranch. She'd been so focused on the evidence and where to take it that she hadn't thought about what Calvin would do to Wade's operation the moment he realized what they were attempting. "He could move against the families here while we're gone," she said. "He could move against the families here while we're figuring out what to do," Wade said. "He's going to know soon that the chest is gone. If I had to guess, I'd say he figures it out by morning." She looked at the papers spread across the table. Thomas's 7 months of posthumous patience, all of it finally out in the open air, and they still didn't have a clean path to do anything with it. "Roy Hendricks," she said, "and Pete Dunnigan's father, and the Kowalski brothers." Wade looked at her. "Not to fight," she said quickly. "Not yet. Just to know. just to be told what's in here, so that if something happens to us, other people know what Thomas found and what it means. The information has to exist in more than one place. Wade thought about this. If we tell more people, there's more chance of someone talking. There's more chance of the information surviving, she countered. Right now, everything Thomas built is in a pile on your kitchen table. If Calvin comes here tonight with enough men, it's over. A silence. Outside, Frank the dog made one low sound at something in the dark, and then went quiet. I'll ride out to the Kowalski brothers in the morning, Wade said. Quietly. I trust Dmitri Kowalski as much as I trust anyone. He's got cause. Calvin's been pressing on his water rights for 2 years. And Roy can be told without going out to him because Roy comes to town most days.
What about Pete Dunnigan's father? Martha thought. Not yet. I don't know enough about him. Pete's trustworthy, but that doesn't necessarily extend. She started organizing the papers back into the chest, not randomly, but in the order Thomas had arranged them, because Thomas's order was deliberate, and she didn't want to disturb it. One more thing. We need a copy. A copy of all of this? Wade looked at the volume of papers. Not everything. The key documents, the relief fund reconciliation, the land transfer anomalies, the map. She looked at him. If something happens to the originals, we need something left. That's 2-3 days of writing. Then we start tonight. He looked at her for a moment. This woman who had shown up at his ranch 2 days ago with flour on her dress and a bruised wrist, and who was now sitting at his table organizing a dead man's evidence and talking about contingency copies with the calm practicality of someone who had accepted that there were no safe options and was simply choosing the least dangerous ones. All right, he said, I'll get more paper. They worked until past midnight. Wade had better handwriting than she'd expected, which, he explained without being asked, was because his mother had been a school teacher and had views about penmanship that she'd enforced with significant dedication. Martha managed the originals and told him which sections mattered most. He copied in his steady, clear hand. When she needed a break from organizing and explaining, she took over the copying and he sorted. They moved around each other in the kitchen without friction, the way two people moved together when they were both focused on the same thing and neither of them was trying to take up more space than they needed. At some point she made more coffee and he didn't say thank you, and she didn't expect him to, because they were past the stage of thank yous for small things, which happen faster in crisis than in regular life. Around 1 in the morning, Wade set down his pen and stretched his neck to one side until it cracked audibly. Thomas documented the water diversion, he said. It wasn't a question. She looked up from the page she was reading. Which one? Mine, he said. She found the page. Wade's name was in Thomas's ledger in connection with a water rights claim from 2 years ago, an entry that showed Calvin's bank had filed a competing claim on the stream that fed the northeast pasture of the Carson Ranch, a claim that should have been denied under territorial water law, but that had been forwarded to the land office without the proper notification to the existing rights holder. You knew about the claim? She asked. I knew there was a filing, Wade said. Teller sent me a letter saying the competing claim had been dismissed. I assumed that was the end of it. He looked at the ledger entry. Thomas's entry suggests it wasn't dismissed. It was suspended, which means Calvin can reactivate it any time he wants to. The water claim was leverage. Of course it was. Calvin didn't exercise it because he didn't need to. It was an instrument he could deploy at any time to complicate Wade's operation, which meant it was a way of keeping Wade manageable. In Calvin's calculation, most people were manageable if you held the right threat over them. He'd miscalculated on Wade. And now, Martha thought, he was probably beginning to understand exactly how much that miscalculation was going to cost him. Add it to the copy, she said. The water claim documentation. It goes in. Already ahead of you, Wade said, and picked up his pen. The next morning brought Dmitri Kowalski to the ranch before breakfast, which meant Wade had ridden out very early because Dmitri's place was 6 miles east, and the man was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee in his large hands when Martha came downstairs. He was a broad, quiet man in his 50s, with a gray beard and the particular weathered patience of someone who had built something hard in difficult country and intended to keep it. He looked at Martha when she came in, and his expression was direct and not unkind. Wade said you have Thomas Boone's records, he said. I do. Thomas was a good man. He was. What do you need from me? She sat down across from him and laid it out plainly,
the way she'd decided she would do it. Not softening the edges, not managing his reaction, just the facts as Thomas had documented them and what they needed to happen next. Dmitri listened without interrupting, which she was beginning to think was a quality shared by men in this part of the territory who were worth trusting. When she finished, he sat with it for a moment. "The Whitfield land," he said. "The one Calvin took from Dora." "Yes." "Dora Whitfield taught my daughters to read," he said. "Ran a school out of her house for 3 years before she couldn't anymore." He looked at his coffee. "I want to see the documents." She showed him. He went through them slowly, asking questions that were specific and intelligent, and she answered each one. Wade sat at the end of the table and let her run it, which she appreciated. After an hour, Dmitri looked up. "What's the plan?" he asked. "We need to get the original documents to someone with the authority to act on them," Martha said. "We're trying to determine who that is. In the meantime, we need people here who know what the documents contain, in case something happens. In case Calvin moves on you before you can get the records out," Dmitri said plainly. "Yes. My brothers and I can be at this ranch in under an hour if we're needed," he said. "Between us and Wade and Roy Hendricks, that's 8 men. Calvin runs maybe 12 hired guns, but half of them are saloon muscle and not much use out of the building." He looked at Wade. "I'm not talking about a fight. I'm talking about enough people that a fight becomes a bad idea for him." "That's exactly what I'm talking about," Wade said. Dmitri stood and put his hat on. "You'll need to move fast," he said. "Calvin will know by today that whatever he was looking for in your building is gone. Men like him don't wait once they know they're running out of time." After Dmitri left, Martha and Wade looked at each other across the table. "He's right," she said. "I know," Wade said. "We can't wait for a safe option. There is no safe option. We choose the least dangerous one, and we move." "Judge Harmon," Wade said. "Yes." "I'll ride to Clearfield today. Alone. You stay here with the documents." "No," she said. He looked at her. "If Calvin figures out what's happening and you're alone on a road 40 miles from here, he sends 2 men and it's over," she said. "We go together. Dmitri and his brothers watch the ranch and hold the copy. Roy Hendricks is in town. We ride to Clearfield, we present it to Judge Harmon, and we come back. And if Harmon's compromised? Then we've learned something important, and we go to the territorial capital, and we don't come back until it's done." She held his gaze. "I know what I'm saying. I know it's not safe. I'm saying it anyway." He was quiet. She could see him working through it, checking it from different angles. "We leave in 2 hours," he said. "I need to talk to Dmitri again, and I need to get the horses ready." "I need to pack the documents correctly," she said. "The originals. They need to be wrapped properly for a hard ride." She spent the next 90 minutes doing exactly that, wrapping the most critical documents in oilcloth, packing them into a saddlebag she'd lined with an extra layer of canvas from Wade's barn, organizing them so that even if the bag got wet or took rough handling, the pages would survive. She packed the copies separately in the chest, which she left locked under Dmitri Kowalski's supervision. She took Thomas's second letter from the bottom of the chest before she locked it. She didn't read it. She just put it in her coat pocket. They were saddled and ready to leave when Pete Dunnigan came running up the ranch road at a speed that told Martha everything she needed to know before the boy had said a single word. He pulled up at the fence, bent double, breathing hard. "Calvin," he managed. "He came into the feed store this morning. I heard him talking to Mr. Harper. He knows the chest is gone." Pete straightened, still breathing hard, his face red. He said, whoever has it has until noon to return it, or he's going to start calling in every debt he's got paper on in this valley, all at once." Martha looked at Wade. "How many families does that affect?" she asked. "In this valley?" Wade's jaw was tight. 12, maybe 15, small operations, most of them. They can't absorb a simultaneous debt call. "He'll take the ranches," she said, "not just the ones he's already positioned for the railroad, all of them." "It's a threat," Wade said, "to force our hand." "It's working," Pete said, with the directness of a 12-year-old who didn't see any reason to soften the situation. Martha looked at the saddlebags on her horse, the oilcloth-wrapped documents, 40 miles to Clearfield on a hard road, and the clock already running. "We ride faster," she said. "Martha, if we ride hard, we can be in Clearfield before dark. If we reach Harmon tonight and he's clean, he can issue a hold on any debt calls pending investigation. That buys time. She was already checking the cinch on her saddle. If we stay here because we're afraid to go, Calvin wins by noon. That's not a choice. Wade put his hand on his horse's neck. Pete, he said, without turning, go back to town. Go to Roy Hendricks and tell him what you told us. Tell him to make sure people know that if Calvin calls in those debts, there's help coming. Can you do that? Yes, sir, Pete said. Don't let Calvin see you running, Wade said. Walk normal, like you just ran an errand for your father and you're going back. Pete squared his shoulders in the particular way of a young person deciding to be older than they were. Okay, he said, and walked back down the road at a carefully normal pace that Martha found, in spite of everything, almost heartbreaking. They were 2 miles out of the ranch, moving fast on the Clearfield Road, when Wade pulled up suddenly and Martha brought her horse around. Someone's following, he said, not looking back. She made herself not turn around. How many? One rider, about a quarter-mile back. Been there since we left the ranch. He kept his eyes ahead. Keeping distance, not closing. Calvin's man? Or someone Calvin sent to see where we're going? He thought for a moment. If we go to Clearfield, he knows we're going to the judge. He was going to figure that out eventually. There's a difference between eventually and right now, Wade said. Right now, Calvin still thinks he has leverage. The debt threat. The clock. If he knows we've already moved on him, he'll act faster, she said. Yes, she thought. The road ahead curved around a long stand of cottonwood following the creek line. Past the cottonwoods, it opened onto flat ground for about 2 miles, completely exposed. If they were going to do something about the rider behind them, it was now or after 2 miles of open country where everything they did would be visible. The cottonwoods, she said. Wade looked at her. Let me take the documents and keep going, she said. You circle back through the trees and you talk to whoever it is. Talk to. Find out who sent him, whether it's an instruction or just eyes. She held out her hand for the saddlebags. I know the Clearfield Road. I've ridden it twice, once with Thomas in summer, and once alone last March. I don't need you to navigate it for me. He looked at her for a moment with something that was not quite argument and not quite agreement. If you're not in Clearfield by nightfall, he started. I'll be in Clearfield by nightfall, she said, and you'll be an hour behind me. He looked at the road ahead, at the cottonwoods, at her. He handed over the saddlebags. She rode. The cottonwoods closed behind her, and she didn't look back. The road opened up ahead onto the flat ground, and she let the horse move into a real gallop, the cold air coming at her face, the saddlebag riding solid against her knee. The land rolled out on both sides, brown and gold in the autumn, and the sky above it was the hard, clear blue of a day with no mercy in it. She thought about Thomas at his kitchen table in the middle of the night. She thought about the letter in her coat pocket, the second one, the one she still hadn't read. She thought about Dora Whitfield teaching children to read in her own house until she had no house left to teach in. She rode faster. Behind her, in the cottonwood stand, she heard nothing. No voices, no scuffle, no shot. Silence, and then hoofbeats, 2 sets, moving east away from the Clearfield Road. Wade must have persuaded whoever it was that the smarter decision was somewhere else entirely. She was alone on the road, the documents wrapped in oilcloth against her knee, and 40 miles of hard country ahead of her before nightfall. The sun was still climbing when she hit the first ridge, and she stopped at the top to let the horse breathe. From the ridge, she could see back toward the valley, toward where Dry Creek sat invisible below its own tree line, where Calvin Rourke was sitting in his saloon probably thinking he had until noon to wait before his leverage paid off. She was going to disappoint him. She opened her coat enough to feel the pocket where Thomas's letter sat, just to confirm it was there, and then she closed her coat and turned the horse and went down the north side of the ridge toward Clearfield, and she didn't stop again until she could see the roof lines of the county seat appearing out of the late afternoon haze like something solid finally rising up to meet her. Clearfield was bigger than Dry Creek the way a river was bigger than a creek, not just in size but in the specific weight of it, the sense that more things had been decided here and more things would be. Martha rode in on the north road as the last light was going orange behind the western ridge line, her horse tired under her and her back aching in the particular way that came from riding hard for hours without stopping properly. She found the courthouse by the simple method of looking for the largest building on the main street, which it was. 2 stories of territorial sandstone with a covered porch and a flagpole out front and lights burning in the ground floor windows. A clerk was locking the front door as she pulled up. "I need to see Judge Harmon," she said. The clerk looked at her the way clerks in official buildings looked at people who arrived on horseback at closing time, with the specific expression of a man calculating how much trouble it was going to be to say no. "The judge's hours are 9 to 4, he said. "You can come back tomorrow." "I have ridden 40 miles today," Martha said. "I have documents relating to an active fraud and extortion operation affecting 15 families in this county, and I need to speak to Judge Harmon tonight before someone acts on those documents in a way that cannot be undone by morning." The clerk blinked. "Your name?" he said. "Martha Boone. My late husband was Thomas Boone. He was an accountant." Something shifted in the clerk's expression at the name. Not recognition exactly, but the slight realignment of a man who was updating his assessment of a situation. "Wait here," he said. She waited on the courthouse steps with her hand on the saddlebag, and the cold coming in properly now that the sun was gone. Her horse stood with its head slightly low, patient in the way of horses that had learned patience from long experience. Martha pressed 2 fingers against her coat pocket, felt the shape of Thomas's letter there, and took her hand away. The clerk came back in 4 minutes. "The judge will see you," he said, and held the door. Judge Harmon's office smelled of old paper and pipe tobacco, and the particular staleness of a room that was heated by a small stove in the corner and hadn't had a window opened since summer. The judge himself was somewhere in his mid-60s, a lean man with white hair and the kind of face that had been serious for so long it had stopped being an expression and become a feature. He was standing behind his desk when Martha came in, not sitting, which she took as a sign that the clerk had told him enough that he wasn't treating this as a routine end-of-day interruption. "Mrs. Boone," he said, "sit down." "Thank you." She sat. She put the saddlebag on the desk in front of her. He looked at the saddlebag. He looked at her. He sat. "My clerk tells me you've come from Dry Creek," he said. "Yes." "And that you have documents." His voice was measured, giving nothing away. "Regarding Calvin Rourke." She hadn't told the clerk Calvin's name. She watched Harmon's face when he said it, looking for the thing that would tell her whether she was in the right place or whether she'd made a 40-mile mistake. His face told her nothing definitive, but the fact that he'd said the name without prompting, without hesitation, suggested familiarity rather than surprise. "You know him," she said. "I know of him," Harmon said carefully. "He has appeared in matters before this court twice, both times involving land disputes, both times resolved in his favor." He looked at her steadily. "I have wondered, on occasion, whether those resolutions were correct." That was not a guilty man talking. That was a careful man who had been uncertain and was now being given reason to revisit that uncertainty. Martha felt something loosen in her chest that she hadn't realized was wound tight. She opened the saddlebag. She laid it out the same way she'd laid it out for Dmitry Kowalski, methodically, starting with what was clearest and building toward what was most complex. Harmon was a better audience than she'd dared hope. He asked precise questions. He pulled pages toward him and read them himself rather than relying on her summary, and twice he stopped her and went back to an earlier document to check something against it, which told her he was actually working through the logic rather than simply receiving information. When she got to the railroad maps, he went very still. He looked at them for a long time. "Thomas Boone compiled all of this?" he said. "Over approximately 2 years working from Calvin's own records and the territorial filings. And Thomas Boone is deceased. February of this year." Harmon sat back in his chair. He was quiet for long enough that Martha started to count the seconds, a habit she'd developed in difficult conversations because counting gave her something to do with the part of her brain that otherwise spent its time on anxiety. She got to 19 before he spoke. "Where are the originals now?" he asked. "In front of you," she said. "What I've given you are the originals. I have copies held elsewhere." He looked at her. "You made copies before you brought the originals here." "Yes." "Why?" "Because I didn't know if you were the right person to bring them to," she said. "I wanted the information to survive regardless of what happened here tonight." He held her gaze for a moment, and something in his expression shifted. Not warmly, exactly, because he wasn't that kind of man, but with the slight recalibration of someone who had just raised their estimation of the person across the desk. "That was sensible," he said. "My husband taught me to be sensible about documents." Harmon stood and went to the window which looked out onto the dark main street of Clearfield. He stood there with his hands behind his back, and Martha waited, because this was the moment she couldn't control, the moment where another person's character determined what happened next. Calvin Rourke has a great deal of influence in this county, Harmon said, to the window. Not over me. I want to be precise about that. But in general, he has relationships with people at the territorial level. He has money. He has men. He turned. What he appears not to have is the one thing that matters most in a court of law, which is documentation. Your husband gave him the documentation. Yes, she said. If I issue a hold on the debt calls he's threatened, he'll know we've reached you, Martha said. He'll move faster. He'll move against the families before the hold can be enforced locally. Baines won't enforce it, Harmon said flatly. We both know that. No. I can telegraph the territorial marshal's office tonight, Harmon said. Marshal Garrett is not in Calvin Rourke's pocket. I am confident of that because I know Garrett personally and because a man in my position has reason to pay attention to who is in whose pocket. He came back to the desk. But a telegraph response takes time, and Garrett is in the capital, which is 3 days, Martha said. 2.5, hard riding, and he'd need to bring deputies. 3 days is too long, Martha said. If Calvin calls in the debts tomorrow, he won't call them tomorrow, Harmon said. He'll call them the moment he knows you've moved against him legally. Until then, he thinks he has the deadline he set, noon tomorrow. He won't accelerate his own timeline without cause. The judge looked at her steadily. Which means the question is whether he finds out tonight that you've been here. Wade, the rider in the cottonwoods, the single man following them from the ranch. One of Calvin's men followed us from the ranch, Martha said. My companion dealt with him on the road. I don't know what was said. Your companion? Wade Carson. He'll be here within the hour. Harmon wrote something on a piece of paper. I'll telegraph Garrett tonight. I'll hold the original documents here, in this office, in my personal safe. And I'll prepare an order, not yet issued, contingent on the response from the marshal's office, that would void any debt calls made under duress or based on fraudulent instruments. What do we do in the meantime? Martha asked. Go back, he said. Go back and hold the situation until Garrett can respond. You've done the critical thing. You've gotten the evidence to someone who can act on it legally. Now you have to give that process time to work. 3 days is a long time in Dry Creek right now, she said. I know it is, he said. I'm sorry for that. He said it without condescension, just plainly. I don't have a faster solution that doesn't make things worse. A judge issuing orders that can't be enforced locally against a man with 12 armed hands does more damage than it prevents. That was honest. She didn't like it, but it was honest. She was walking back out through the courthouse when Wade came through the front door, still in his road coat, his face cold from the ride, and his eyes moving immediately to her with the particular focus of a man checking that something is still intact. You made it, he said. I said I would. He looked at her. She looked at him. Harmon, he said. Clean, she said. And capable. He's contacting the territorial marshal tonight. She paused. 3 days? Maybe less? Wade worked through the implications of that the same way he worked through everything, quickly and without wasting time on what he couldn't change. We need to get back, he said. Tonight? Before dawn, at least. Dimitri needs to know the timeline. And Roy... He stopped. What is it? The rider in the cottonwoods, he said. It was a young hand from Garvey's place, not one of Calvin's regulars. Calvin hired him 2 weeks ago. Didn't know what he was riding into, didn't know what he was watching for. When I explained the situation plainly, he made the decision not to report back. You trust that? I trust that he's 17 years old and scared, and he's not going back to work for Calvin Rourke, Wade said. Whether that holds under pressure, I don't know. He looked at her. Which means we should assume Calvin knows we came north. She nodded. Harmon's keeping the originals in his safe. We ride back with nothing they can take from us. She paused. We still have the copies at the ranch. They rode back in the dark, trading off the lead so neither horse wore out, and the night was cold enough that she could see her breath, and the stars were hard and bright overhead, the way they got when the air was truly clear. The road was pale beneath them, and the land on either side was dark and quiet and enormous, in the way land was enormous at night when you couldn't see the edges of it. I read Thomas's letter, she said, about an hour out of Clearfield. She hadn't planned to say it. It came out without a decision being made about it. Wade glanced at her. The second one. Yes. He waited. He said he was sorry he hadn't told me sooner, she said. About the records, about what he'd found. He said he was trying to protect me from it, and he understood that was the wrong decision, but he'd made it anyway because he was afraid, and that he'd spent his whole life being more afraid than he wanted anyone to know. She paused. He said the land? The 22 acres. He said he'd registered it in both our names after we married, and he hadn't told me that either, and he was sorry for that too. Another pause. He said that if anyone was capable of doing something with what he'd found, it was me. Not him. Me. She felt the night air on her face, cold and steady. He believed that, apparently. He just didn't say it while he was alive. Wade rode beside her for a moment without speaking. Do you believe it? He said. I'm on a dark road 40 miles from home with a judge's promise and a 3-day timeline, she said. I don't have the luxury of not believing it. He made a small sound that might have been the beginning of a laugh that he'd decided not to finish. They reached the ranch just before 4 in the morning, and Dmitry Kowalski was sitting on the porch with a rifle across his knees, which told Martha that the night had not been entirely quiet. 2 riders came past about midnight, Dmitry said, before they dismounted. Slow, looking. They didn't stop, but they went past twice. He looked at Wade. My brothers are in the barn. Were they recognized? Wade asked. I recognized one, Dmitry said. Sid Carver. He works the door at the saloon. Sid Carver was one of Calvin's most reliable men. Not smart, but dependable in the way of a man who did what he was told without asking questions. His being on the road meant Calvin was escalating the surveillance, which meant Calvin was anxious, which meant Calvin suspected more than he knew. Anxious men who suspected things were more dangerous than confident men who were certain, because anxious men moved without waiting for complete information. He knows we went north, Wade said. Most likely, Martha said. The question is whether he knows we reached Harmon. We act as though he does, Wade said. Inside, Martha spread the copy documents on the table and briefed Dmitry on what Harmon had said and what the timeline was. Dmitry listened with his elbows on the table and his hands folded together, and when she finished, he said, 3 days is manageable if we're organized. We need people who won't run, Wade said. My brothers won't run, Dmitry said. Hendricks won't run. The Sutter brothers on the South Creek. Calvin's been leaning on them for 8 months, and they're past the point of being frightened into compliance. He looked at Wade. How many men does he bring if he comes here? He's not going to come here in force, Martha said. Not yet. He doesn't want an open confrontation that looks like what it is, a criminal protecting himself. He wants this to look like debt collection and legal process. She looked at the map on the table. His move is the debt calls. That's his weapon. He calls in 12 families at once and creates enough chaos and desperation that people stop paying attention to what we're doing and start scrambling to save their own operations. So we have to make sure the families know they have support, Dmitry said. And that help is coming, Martha said. That they don't have to capitulate to a debt call that's fraudulent, and that there's a legal process already in motion that will address it. She paused. They have to believe that. Not because we've promised them magic, but because it's true. Harmon is real. The marshal is real. The documents are real. If people will hold for 3 days, some of them won't, Wade said. Some of them will panic and sign whatever Calvin puts in front of them. Some of them, she agreed, but not all. And the ones who hold are the ones who matter. How do we reach them? Dmitry asked. Roy Hendricks, Wade said. He can move through town without attracting attention, and Pete Dunnigan. I'm not comfortable putting that boy in the middle of this, Martha said. Pete Dunnigan put himself in the middle of this, Wade said, not without something like respect in his voice. He's been in the middle of it since he came running up the road yesterday. He knows it, and he's made his own choice about it. That was probably true. It didn't make her feel entirely better about it, but it was true. They slept in shifts. Martha took 3 hours on the narrow bed in the upstairs room and woke to the sound of horses in the yard and voices she didn't immediately recognize, and came downstairs to find 2 men she knew by sight. The Kowalski brothers, Jan and Piotr, broad and quiet like Dmitry but younger, sitting at the table with coffee and a conversation that stopped when she entered. Mrs. Boone, Jan said, with the particular courtesy of a man who'd been raised to stand when a woman entered and was compromising with the situation by straightening in his chair instead. Sit down, she said, and went to the stove. Wade came in from outside a few minutes later with Roy Hendricks behind him, Roy looking like he hadn't slept and had ridden fast. Calvin's calling a meeting, Roy said, before he was fully through the door. This morning, at the saloon, he's invited every rancher in the valley, sent riders out at first light, says he wants to discuss outstanding accounts and reach mutual resolution. Martha looked at Wade. He's moving the timeline up, she said. If he gets everyone in one room, Wade said, and he presents the debt calls face to face with his men in the building, people will sign, Martha finished, because they'll be afraid and there won't be time to think and they'll be alone in a room with him. She turned to Roy. What time is the meeting? Noon, Roy said. Noon. The same deadline Calvin had given them. She didn't think that was coincidence. We have to be there, she said. The room went quiet. She could feel everyone doing the same calculation, the same rapid assessment of what that meant and what the risks were. If Calvin has all the ranchers in that saloon, she said, and we're not there to tell them the truth, he tells them his version of it, and they have no other information to work with. They're cornered and frightened and alone. She set down her coffee cup. But if we're there, if I'm there, I can tell them what Thomas found. I can tell them about Harmon. I can give them a reason to hold. Calvin's men will be in that building, Dimitri said, armed. Yes, he'll have us exactly where he wants us, Wade said. He thinks he will, Martha said, but he doesn't know what we know about his timeline. He thinks he's forcing our hand. He doesn't know that by moving this meeting up, he's actually given us an opportunity. She looked at the faces around the table. If I can speak to those families, if I can show them even a fraction of what Thomas documented, the debt calls lose their power. You can't frighten people into compliance when they know the threat is based on fraud. He won't let you speak, Wade said. He'll try to stop me, she said. He won't succeed. Not if everyone in that room is watching. There was a silence. I'll be there, Dimitri said. And us, Jan said, with a look at Pyotr that was more consultation than anyone outside those two would have caught. Roy, Wade said. Roy Hendricks looked at the table. He was thinking about the morning on Main Street when he'd watched and done nothing, she knew, because it was written on his face as clearly as if he'd said it. I'll be there, Roy said. It took 2 hours to prepare. Martha drafted, in plain language on a single page, the core of what Thomas had found. The diverted relief money, the manufactured debts, the fraudulent land transfers, the railroad maps. She kept it to 1 page because people under pressure didn't read more than 1 page. She kept it simple because complex documents frightened people who were already frightened. She wrote it in the language of someone explaining facts to a neighbor, not the language of a court filing. Wade read it over her shoulder. This is good, he said. It's Thomas's work, she said. I'm just translating it. No, he said. This is yours. She didn't argue. There wasn't time. They rode into Dry Creek just before noon, Martha and Wade and Dmitri Kowalski, with Jan and Pyotr coming separately by a different road so they didn't all arrive in a group that announced itself. Roy Hendricks was already in town. Main Street was different from 2 days ago. Busier, but differently busy. The kind of crowd that gathered because something was about to happen and people wanted to see it even if they didn't want to be part of it. Horses were tied outside the saloon. Martha recognized the brands on 3 of them as belonging to families from the Eastern Valley, which meant Calvin's riders had been effective this morning. She dismounted in front of the saloon and didn't wait for Wade. The Silver Creek was loud inside. Not the loose, comfortable loud of a normal gambling night, but the compressed, nervous loud of too many people in a space with too much at stake, the kind of noise that had tension running under it like a current under muddy water. Maybe 20 men, ranchers mostly, standing or sitting with their hats in their hands, and the particular expression of people who'd been summoned and weren't sure what they'd agreed to by coming. Calvin was at the far end of the room, standing behind a table that had a row of papers on it, documents she could see from the door, official-looking, the kind of papers that were designed to look final and authoritative so that people would sign them without reading carefully. He saw her when she was about 12 feet into the room. The expression that moved across his face was fast and complex. Surprise, then a rapid recalculation, then the return of the controlled pleasantness he usually wore in public, and under all of it something she recognized as the specific look of a man deciding how to handle something he hadn't planned for. "Martha Boone," he said, loudly enough for the room. "I didn't realize you were still in the county." The room turned, 20 faces, most of them men she knew or knew of, looking at her the way they'd looked at her on Main Street, with the wariness of people who didn't want to be standing near trouble when it arrived. She walked to the middle of the room. She didn't rush, and she didn't slow down. "I have something to tell all of you," she said, not loud, not theatrical, just the voice she used when she needed to be heard. "This is a private business meeting," Calvin said. "Mrs. Boone, I'll ask you to leave." "Eve." "You'll ask," she said. "You won't get." She had one page. She'd given copies to Wade and Roy before she walked in case Calvin's men took hers. She unfolded it. "My husband Thomas Boone spent 2 years documenting what Calvin Rourke has done with money that belonged to you," she said. "Relief money, loan money, the money the territorial government sent to this valley 3 years ago to help families through the drought." She looked at the faces around her. She found Roy near the door, and Dimitri by the far wall, and she didn't look for Wade because she knew he was behind her somewhere, and that was enough. "That money was diverted. Your applications were denied not because there wasn't enough to go around, but because the man standing at the end of this room took the money that was meant for your families and used it to build his own land position ahead of the railroad." The room had gone very quiet. "She's a grieving widow making accusations she can't prove," Calvin said, from the end of the room. His voice was still controlled, but it was controlled the way a valve was controlled, something pushing against it from the other side. "This is a desperate woman who owes money the same as everyone else in this room, and she's—" "The documents are with Judge Harmon in Clearfield," Martha said. She said it clearly, to the room, not to Calvin. "As of last night, Harmon is in contact with the Territorial Marshal's office. The debt calls this man is asking you to sign today are based on instruments that a judge has already been asked to review for fraud." She looked at the papers on Calvin's table. "Don't sign anything today. You have the right to wait. You have the right to legal counsel, and you have the right to know that the reason these debts are being called right now, in a hurry, in a room with armed men at the door," she glanced at the 2 men who'd materialized at the front entrance, "is because Calvin Rourke is running out of time. Not you. Him." The silence stretched. 20 men looking from her to Calvin and back again. Calvin moved first. He came around the table fast, and the 2 men at the door moved with him, and Martha felt the room shift. The particular gathering of energy that happened when violence decided whether to happen or not. Wade stepped between her and Calvin. Not dramatically, not like something out of a story. He just stepped into the space, the way you stepped in front of something that was moving toward something it shouldn't reach, and put himself there and stopped. "Don't," Wade said. Calvin pulled up short. The 2 men behind him pulled up short. The room was completely still. Calvin looked at Wade, at Martha, at the 20 ranchers watching every movement. He was calculating. She could see him calculating. He had more men in this room, but every man in this room was watching him, and what he did in the next 10 seconds was what they would all remember and what they would all be able to say they witnessed. He understood that. He wasn't a stupid man. He understood that the moment he put hands on a woman in front of 20 witnesses in a room where half of them were already reconsidering their situation, he stopped being a businessman with legal instruments and started being something that even his allies would find difficult to defend. He made himself smile. It didn't reach anything above his jaw. "This is not over," he said, to no one in particular. "No," Martha said, from behind Wade's shoulder. "It's not, but it's starting to be." She looked at the ranchers. "Go home," she said. "Don't sign anything today. 3 days. Just give it 3 days." They went. Not all at once, not quickly, but they went, filing out with their hats still in their hands, some of them looking at her as they passed, some of them not, some of them stopping long enough to say something quiet that she couldn't always hear. One older man, she knew him only as the fellow who ran the eastern cattle operation above Sycamore Ridge, stopped directly in front of her and said, "Thomas Boone was a good man," and walked out. Calvin stood at the end of the empty room with his documents on the table and his men around him and watched them leave. When the last rancher was through the door, Martha turned to go. Wade moved with her. At the threshold, she stopped and looked back at Calvin, at the deliberate arrangement of a powerful man in the center of his own space. And she thought of Thomas at his kitchen table in the middle of the night, building the thing that would undo all of this with nothing but patience and a pen. "You should have left the land alone," she said. "You should have left all of them alone." She walked out into the hard afternoon light of Main Street, and the door swung shut behind her, and for the first time in 2 days the cold air felt like something other than threat. 3 days, she had told them. 3 days. She could hold 3 days. 3 days felt like a different kind of time than regular time. Regular time moved in a direction. 3 days of waiting for a territorial marshal while Calvin Rourke sat in his saloon 40 feet from the people you'd asked to trust you. That time moved in circles, folding back on itself, each hour feeling like a review of everything that could still go wrong. Martha spent the first of those 3 days at the ranch doing what she always did when her mind was running too fast for her body to keep up with it. She cooked, she organized. She went through the copy documents one more time and made a second copy of the most critical pages, because having 2 copies was better than 1, and her hands needed something to do. Wade watched her from across the kitchen without commenting on the fact that she'd now copied the same relief fund reconciliation 3 times, which she appreciated. The Kowalski brothers took shifts on the road. Roy Hendricks moved through town in his ordinary way, buying feed, talking to people at the well, carrying information back and forth in the casual manner of a man doing his regular business. He reported that Calvin had not left the saloon since the meeting, that his men were visible on the street in larger numbers than usual, that Teller at the land office had closed early 2 days in a row, which Roy said he'd never seen Teller do in 6 years. "Teller knows," Wade said when Roy reported this. "Teller's calculating," Martha said. "He's deciding which way to fall before the fall happens." "Men like Teller always do that," Roy said. He said it without particular bitterness, just as an observation about a category of person he'd known all his life. "The question is whether he falls toward Calvin or toward whoever he thinks is going to win." "Then we make sure he thinks we're going to win," Martha said. "Are we?" Roy asked. Not challenging her, genuinely asking. She thought about Harmon's safe, and the telegraph to Marshal Garrett, and the careful columns of Thomas's handwriting that she'd now memorized well enough to recite in her sleep. "Yes," she said. She said it because she believed it, and also because Roy Hendricks needed to hear someone say it with certainty, and also because sometimes the act of saying something certain was itself a kind of architecture. You built the certainty first with words, and then you worked to make the structure real. The second day was harder. Calvin moved in the morning. Not the way they'd expected. Not a confrontation, not a legal filing, not armed riders on the road. He moved the way a man moved when he understood that open violence had closed off as an option, and he needed another kind of pressure. He sent a woman. Her name was Agnes Pruitt, and she was the wife of one of the smaller ranchers in the valley, a man named Del Pruitt, who ran about 30 head on 120 acres south of town. Agnes arrived at the Carson Ranch mid-morning with her youngest on her hip and 2 older children walking behind her, and she didn't look like someone Calvin had sent. She looked like a woman who was genuinely frightened, which Martha suspected she was, because the best instrument Calvin Rourke had ever found was people's real fear, used for his purposes. Martha brought her inside and sat her down and gave the children bread with butter, which was the only thing resembling a maternal instinct she was willing to deploy without thinking about it first. "Del signed," Agnes said. "Last night. Calvin sent a man to the house after dark with the papers, and Del signed because we have 3 children and 30 head of cattle, and the note on the property is real. Martha, we really do owe money. It wasn't manufactured. We borrowed from Calvin's bank 2 years ago when the creek flooded and we needed a new section of fence, and—" She stopped. "He signed, and now I don't know what we have." Martha looked at the paper Agnes had brought with her. It was a debt settlement agreement transferring a portion of the Pruitt property to a landholding company she'd seen in Thomas's documents, one of the shell structures Calvin used to obscure his acquisitions. "The debt is real," Martha said carefully, "but the terms of this agreement aren't. The interest rate applied here is above what the territorial banking code allows. That alone makes this voidable." She looked up at Agnes. "Del signed under duress at night with a man at his door. A judge can consider those circumstances." "Can a judge give us back what we had yesterday morning?" Agnes said. "Not angry." Just tired in the specific way of someone who'd been frightened for a long time and had finally arrived at a question they needed answered. Harmon can, Martha said. When the marshal arrives and the fraud case opens, every transfer tied to Calvin's instruments gets reviewed, including this one. She folded the paper and handed it back. Keep that. Don't sign anything else. And tell him he didn't ruin anything. Calvin has been doing this to people for 3 years and building it so that each individual transaction looks normal. Dell is not the only one who signed something he shouldn't have. Agnes looked at her across the table. She was maybe 28 years old, which was young enough that Martha remembered being that age, and the specific vulnerability of it, the way everything felt permanent that wasn't. "How are you so calm?" Agnes asked. Martha considered that. "I'm not calm," she said. "I'm organized. Those look similar from the outside, but they're different on the inside." After Agnes left, Martha sat at the table for a while. Wade came in from the yard and poured himself coffee and didn't immediately say anything, which was becoming a pattern she'd stopped being surprised by. "She won't be the last one who signed," she said. "No," he agreed. Calvin's been working the outlying families, the ones who weren't at the meeting or who were too frightened to hold. She looked at her hands. "We asked people to trust us for 3 days, and some of them can't hold 3 days because their children are hungry and their fences are broken and the fear is too close." "That's not your fault," Wade said. "I didn't say it was my fault. I said it's happening." She looked up. "We need to speed up the timeline. Garrett's already writing." "I know. But is there anyone between here and the Capitol who has authority to issue a temporary hold? Not a full investigation, just a temporary hold on debt enforcement pending review?" Wade thought. "A federal land surveyor has some authority over disputes touching surveyed railroad corridors." She looked at him. "The railroad maps," she said. "If the projected corridor passes through properties under disputed transfer, then the survey office has standing to freeze those transfers pending verification of the corridor's legal status." She was already thinking through it. "Where's the nearest survey office?" "Millhaven," Wade said. 22 miles west. There's a federal survey station there. It's small, 2 men, but it's federal authority." "Federal authority outranks a county debt call," Martha said. "In theory. In sufficient theory to give people something to point to." She stood up. "I need to write a letter. To the survey office. With the relevant sections of Thomas's documentation." "Martha, it's not a guarantee," she said. "It's another layer. Another piece of paper that stands between Calvin's deadline and the families who are still holding." She found paper and the pen on the shelf. "Every layer we add is one more reason for people to wait one more day." She wrote the letter in an hour. It was precise and specific and cited the relevant territorial statutes by number, which she knew from Thomas's notes because Thomas had been the kind of man who cited statutes by number. Wade read it when she was done. "You should have been a lawyer," he said. "I'm a baker," she said. "Who memorized her husband's paperwork." Roy Hendricks took the letter to Millhaven himself, because he was the one person whose absence from Dry Creek on a given day wouldn't raise questions, and because he seemed to have arrived at a place inside himself where doing things was better than not doing them, which Martha recognized as the particular conversion that happened to people once they'd stopped being bystanders. He was back by evening with a response. Not a formal order, not yet, but a written acknowledgement from the senior surveyor at Millhaven that the properties in question fell within a zone of federal survey interest, and that any transfer affecting those properties was subject to verification before finalization. It wasn't a freeze, but it was a federal letterhead, and it had a seal on it, and sometimes what people needed when they were frightened was a piece of paper with a seal on it that told them someone with authority was paying attention. Martha made 12 copies that night. Wade wrote most of them because his hand didn't cramp the way hers did after the 3rd copy, and she organized them and addressed each one to a specific family by name. "You know all their names," Wade said, about halfway through. "Thomas kept a list," she said. "Everyone he believed had been affected. He kept their names and their circumstances." She kept writing. He never met most of them personally. He just kept their names. Wade was quiet for a moment. "That's the kind of man he was," he said. "Yes," she said. "It is." The 3rd day began at 4 in the morning with horses on the road. Martha heard them before Wade did. She'd been sleeping lightly since she arrived,
The particular light sleep of someone who had given their nervous system a job to do, and she was at the window before the sound had fully resolved into identifiable hoofbeats. Multiple horses. Moving at a steady pace, not panicked, not rushing, but purposeful. She counted. 6 horses. Maybe 7. Not Calvin's people. Calvin's men rode with the loose, casual spacing of men who weren't afraid of being seen. These horses were riding in a closer formation, the kind of formation that belonged to men who had a job to do and were moving efficiently toward doing it. She was downstairs before Wade appeared at the top of the stairs. "Someone's coming," she said. "I heard." He was already pulling on his boots. They were on the porch when the riders came into the yard, and the first light of early morning was gray enough that it took Martha a moment to read the badge on the lead rider's coat, and when she did, she felt something release in her chest that she hadn't known was locked. Marshal Garrett was a lean man in his 40s with a weathered face and a quiet authority that needed no performance to establish itself. He dismounted with the efficiency of someone who'd been in a saddle for 2.5 days and was ready to be done with it, but wasn't going to show that to anyone. "Mrs. Boone?" he said. "Yes. I'm Marshal Garrett. Judge Harmon telegraphed me 2 days ago. I've been riding since." He looked at her steadily. "I have 5 deputies and a warrant issued by the Territorial Court for the arrest of Calvin Rourke on charges of embezzlement, fraud, extortion, and illegal land acquisition." He paused. "Harmon said you'd have the additional documentation." "The copies are inside," she said. "The originals are in Harmon's safe in Clearfield." "Then let's look at the copies," Garrett said, "and after that we go to town." They spent an hour at the kitchen table, Garrett and one of his deputies going through the copies while Martha explained and answered questions. Garrett was fast, faster than Harmon, because he'd had 2 days of writing to think about what he was writing toward, and had already framed the legal architecture in his mind. He asked sharp questions and accepted sharp answers, and didn't waste time on anything that wasn't essential. "The debt calls he issued," Garrett said. "Any of them signed?" "At least one that I know of," Martha said. "The Prewitt property. There may be others." "Those get frozen pending investigation," Garrett said. "All of them. Anything touched by a fraudulent instrument is suspended until the court reviews the underlying transaction." He closed the folder. "That's going to take months to work through completely." "But the families can stay on their land during that process?" "They can stay," Garrett said. "Nobody gets moved while there's an active federal investigation into the validity of the transfers." Martha sat with that for a moment. Months of legal process, and none of it clean or fast, and families who would spend that time in uncertainty. But they would stay on their land. They would have time. Time was the thing Thomas had been trying to buy with his careful documentation, and here it was, finally purchased with everything he'd left behind. "All right," she said, "let's go to town." They rode in as the morning was properly starting, 7 o'clock, the light coming in full and honest the way it did after the flattering gold of early morning had burned off. Dry Creek was beginning its day. The woman at the well. The boy sweeping the walk. Pete Dunnigan, she noted, who saw them coming and went very still with the broom in his hands, and then, when he understood what he was looking at, put the broom carefully against the wall and stood up straight. Garrett rode directly to the Silver Creek Saloon. Calvin was inside, which Martha had half expected and half feared. A man like Calvin didn't run until he was certain running was the only option, and a man like Calvin didn't become certain of anything quickly, because certainty required accepting information that contradicted what you wanted to be true. I was sitting at his usual table with 2 of his men when Garrett walked through the door with 4 deputies behind him, and the expression on Calvin Rourke's face went through several stages in the space of about 3 seconds. Recognition of Garrett's badge, then calculation, then the specific look of a man rapidly assessing his options and finding them fewer than he'd planned for. Martha came in behind the deputies. That was the moment she saw something change in Calvin's face that she hadn't seen there before. Not the controlled pleasantness, not the amusement, not even the cold anger she'd seen on Main Street when she'd held onto the post and refused to go where he was pulling her. This was something rawer than any of those. This was a man looking at a woman he'd dismissed and dragged through the dirt and mocked in front of a street full of people, and understanding that she was the reason his entire construction was coming apart. It wasn't a satisfying thing to see. She'd expected it to feel more final, more like something resolved. Instead, it just looked like a man in a moment he couldn't undo.
Calvin Rourke, Garrett said. I have a warrant for your arrest issued by the territorial court. You'll come with me. Calvin's two men looked at each other. They looked at the four deputies. They made the calculation that people made when the arithmetic no longer favored them, and they made it fast. Don't, Calvin said to them very quietly. They didn't. They sat back. Calvin stood. He straightened his coat with the precise, controlled gesture of a man who had decided that whatever else happened, he would not fall apart in public. He looked at Garrett. He looked at the deputies. And then he looked at Martha. You don't know what you've started, he said. It wasn't a threat, exactly. It sounded more like a man who genuinely believed that the world he'd built was a normal world, and that dismantling it would cause damage he couldn't predict. Which might even have been partly true, in the complicated way that things were always partly true. I know what Thomas started, Martha said. I just finished it. Calvin held her gaze for one more moment, and then he walked with Marshal Garrett out of the Silver Creek Saloon and into the morning light of Main Street. And the street did what streets did in small towns when something like this happened. It stopped. The woman at the well. Pete Dunnigan, standing straight at the wall. Roy Hendricks, who had appeared from somewhere and was standing in front of the general store with his hat in his hands. People coming out of doorways. People stopping on the sidewalk. Not cheering, not celebrating, just watching, with the specific silence of a community witnessing something it had thought was impossible for a long time. Garrett's deputies took Calvin's men from the saloon one by one, and that took a while. And during that while, Martha stood on the sidewalk and watched, and didn't feel the specific triumphant emotion she thought she might feel. She felt tired. She felt the soreness in her back from too many nights in a narrow bed and too many miles on horseback. She felt the bruise on her wrist, which had gone from purple to yellow-green and still ached in the mornings. She felt the particular hollow of a thing that had taken so long and so much being suddenly, finally, over. Wade appeared beside her at some point during the process. He didn't say anything. He stood next to her and watched, and that was enough. It's done, she said. Most of it, he said. There's a long piece of legal process ahead. I know. She watched Garrett mount his horse. But the part that I could do is done. He looked at her. She looked at him. Thomas did more of it than I did, she said. He built the whole thing. He just ran out of time. He trusted you to finish it, Wade said. That's not a small thing, trusting someone with everything you built. She thought about Thomas at that kitchen table. The lamp, the bent head, the precise, slanted handwriting and the cedar chest and the letter she'd finally read on a cold road in the dark on the way back from Clearfield. He had written in that second letter that he was sorrier for the silence than for anything else, that he had spent their marriage being afraid of the wrong things and certain about the wrong things, and that the one thing he'd been most certain of from the very beginning was her. That he'd kept his fear from her thinking it was protection, and he understood now, writing this with a cold in his chest that he didn't want to name too directly, that protection was just another word for what you did when you didn't trust someone with the truth. He'd trusted her with the truth at the end. She'd done what she could with it. She thought that was enough. She thought Thomas would have thought it was enough. The weeks that followed were not simple. Nothing about the process of undoing 3 years of methodical fraud was ever going to be simple, and anyone who told a different story was either lying or hadn't been paying attention. Garrett's investigation opened the land office records and found Teller at the center of a secondary web of falsified filings that added 3 more months to the timeline. Calvin's lawyer arrived from the Capitol and made arguments that required Harmon to schedule 3 separate hearings before the territorial court. The shell companies Calvin had used for his acquisitions had to be traced through their ownership chains, and 2 of them connected to investors in the Capitol who hired their own lawyers and complicated things further. But the families stayed on their land. That was the thing that held, while everything else moved slowly and imperfectly through the machinery of law. The temporary federal hold became a court order, became a permanent injunction against enforcement of any debt instrument connected to Calvin's operation, pending the outcome of the criminal trial. The Prewitt property reverted. The Whitfield land, Dora Whitfield's 120 acres where she'd run a school out of her house, was formally returned to her estate, which meant to her daughter, who wrote Martha a letter that arrived 6 weeks after Calvin's arrest, and which Martha read twice and then folded and kept. Hank Mercer came back. That happened in the spring, which Martha hadn't expected quite so soon. She'd thought the legal process would move slower than that, and in most respects it did. But Garrett had prioritized the clearest cases first, and Hank's was among the clearest. The manufactured debt documented precisely in Thomas's ledger with the real numbers beside the inflated ones in two separate columns. Hank arrived in Dry Creek on a Tuesday, with his wife and 4 children and very little else, and the first place he came was the bakery, because the bakery was open by then. Martha had gone back to her building the day after Garrett took Calvin to Clearfield, and she'd looked at the broken back lock and the turned mattress and the pulled-out drawers, and she'd spent 1 full hour putting everything back into its right place, and then she'd swept the floor and opened the front shutters and started bread. It wasn't complicated. It was the thing she knew how to do, and the town needed it, and she needed something to do with her hands while the legal process moved at its own pace. She'd fixed the back lock herself, with a replacement mechanism she bought at the hardware, because she was not going to keep living with a lock that didn't catch. The bakery became what she'd said she wanted it to become, a place people came to rather than a place that delivered to other people. She put 2 small tables inside and 1 on the covered walk out front when the weather allowed. And she made bread every morning and soup most days, and whatever else she could manage with the supplies she had, and the hungry travelers and the children and the ranchers who came in for supplies on Saturdays all found something warm waiting for them. It wasn't a grand operation. The tables were mismatched, and the chairs had seen better years, and twice in the first month she burned a batch because she'd gotten distracted by paperwork connected to the investigation and forgotten to watch the time. But it was real, and it was hers, and it was Thomas's name on the deed that she'd finally had properly registered in both their names by the county recorder, which was a small bureaucratic act that felt larger than it probably should have. Wade came by on Thursdays. That started because Thursday was his day in town for supplies, and the bakery was on his route, and the first time he came in, he sat at one of the small tables and drank coffee and ate bread without making any particular conversation about it. The second Thursday the same. By the 4th Thursday, it had become a thing without either of them having decided it was a thing, and Martha stopped being surprised to see him at the corner table at 9 in the morning and started having his coffee ready when she heard his horse outside. They talked about the investigation and its progress at first, because that was what was happening in both their lives. Then about the ranch, the fence section he finally replaced, the water claim that Harmon's ruling had definitively voided, the new arrangement with Dmitry Kowalski's operation that allowed both of them to manage their grazing land more efficiently than either could alone. About Pete Dunnigan, who had been hired part-time by Roy Hendricks to help at the feed store, Roy having arrived at the conclusion that a boy who could organize covert communications across a crisis situation could probably manage inventory. About Agnes Pruitt's youngest, who had taken to coming to the bakery after school and sitting at the outside table doing his lessons with a piece of bread, which Martha had decided to regard as a feature rather than an inconvenience. Sometime in late spring, on a Thursday, Wade said, "I want to ask you something." She was wiping down the counter. "Then ask it." "I'm not going to dress it up," he said. "Good." "I'd like you to consider building something with me," he said. "Not because you need help. You've made it fairly clear you don't need help. And not because I feel obligated after what happened, because I don't think obligation is a good foundation for anything." He was looking at his coffee cup, which was unusual for a man who generally looked directly at the thing he was addressing. "I'd like it because you're the most capable person I've encountered in my life, and because Thursday mornings have become the thing I look forward to most in the week, and because I think we could build something worth building." Martha stopped wiping the counter. She thought about Thomas's letter, the part where he'd said he'd spent their marriage being certain of the wrong things. She thought about what it meant to be offered something real by a man who was constitutionally incapable of offering anything that wasn't, and what it meant to be at a point in her life where she could receive that offer without needing to convert it into something safer. She thought about the bakery with its mismatched tables and the burned batch and the boy doing his lessons on the walk out front. She thought about the 22 acres with Thomas's name properly on the deed now, land she didn't have the people to work, but that she intended to keep anyway. She thought about what she wanted, which was a question Wade had asked her a long time ago on a cold road, and which she'd answered honestly, and which she was still answering. "I'm not easy to live alongside," she said. "I noticed," he said. "I work at strange hours and I have strong opinions about organization, and I will not be treated like I need managing." "I've never once thought you needed managing," he said. "You're not a simple man either," she said. You go quiet when you're troubled and you take on things alone that you shouldn't have to take on alone, and you waited too long before you stopped looking away. All true, he said. That last one you've addressed, she said. I'm working on the others, he said. She looked at him across the counter. He was sitting at his corner table in a work shirt with the sleeves rolled, the same as the day she'd met him properly. The same patient dark eyes, and the same quality of stillness that she'd learned by now was not absence of feeling, but the opposite. A man who felt things completely and had learned to sit with that without letting it run him. Yes, she said. He looked up from his coffee cup. Yes, she said again. Let's build something. He didn't say thank you, and she didn't expect him to, and the morning continued the way mornings did. Agnes Pruitt's youngest arrived at the outside table with his book, and a rider came through wanting bread and water for his horse, and the bread in the oven needed turning, and life in Dry Creek kept moving in the imperfect, ordinary, specific way that it had always moved, except that now the fear had gone out of it. That was the thing she noticed most in the months that followed, as the trial progressed, and the court hearings happened, and Calvin's network of shell companies was picked apart, thread by thread, and the land records were corrected, and the relief money, as much as could be traced, was returned to the families it had been taken from. The fear had gone out of the town, not all at once, not cleanly, because people who'd lived afraid for 3 years didn't stop overnight, but gradually, in the way that things changed when the source of the fear was removed and time was allowed to work on the wound. Dora Whitfield came back in the fall. She was 64 by then, and her joints troubled her, and she moved carefully, but she came back to her land and she started holding reading lessons again, this time in the larger room of her restored house. And the children came the way children always came when there was someone willing to teach them, readily, and with the particular appetite of young minds that had been waiting for the door to open. Martha took bread to her on Wednesdays. It wasn't a grand gesture, it was just bread, and it was just a Wednesday. And Dora Whitfield made tea while Martha put the loaves on the table, and they talked about the town and the weather and the children who were learning to read, and sometimes about Thomas, who Dora had known slightly and respected entirely. He was very quiet, Dora said once. He was, Martha agreed. The quiet ones notice everything, Dora said. They just don't always know what to do with what they've noticed. He figured it out eventually, Martha said. So did you, Dora said. Martha thought about that on the ride back to the ranch, because it was the ranch now. She lived there, had moved her things in stages over the spring and summer with the same practical incrementalism she brought to everything, and the bakery was the bakery, and the ranch was home. She thought about what Dora had said, and about Thomas's careful columns, and the cedar chest, and the 40-mile ride in the dark, and about the moment in the saloon when she'd stood in the middle of a room full of frightened men and said what was true plainly enough for everyone to hear. She didn't think of herself as brave, exactly. Brave was a word people put on things after the fact, when they could see the shape of them clearly. In the moment, she'd mostly been doing what was in front of her to do, one thing and then the next, the way she'd always approached things that mattered. The bread didn't bake itself. The documents didn't file themselves. The truth didn't speak itself. Someone had to do those things. Thomas had done what he could. She'd done the rest. That was not heroism. That was just a person deciding, over and over again, that the work in front of them was worth doing even when it was hard, and even when it was frightening, and even when the people around them were looking away. Most worthwhile things came down to that simple, unglamorous decision made repeatedly in ordinary moments that didn't announce themselves as significant. She thought that was the thing Thomas had understood at his kitchen table in the middle of the night. Not that he was building something historic or that his name would be remembered or that he would be celebrated for it. Just that it was the right thing to do, and that someone who loved the people who'd been hurt ought to do it. She thought that was enough. She still thought that. The horse knew the road home by then and didn't need much guidance, and the evening light came down long and level across the valley, turning the grass the color of something you couldn't quite name but recognized. And in the distance, the ranch house sat solid and lit against the darkening hills. And Frank the old dog was probably on the porch, and Wade was probably in the barn finishing something he'd meant to finish 2 hours ago, and tomorrow the bakery would need bread and the bread wouldn't bake itself. Martha let the horse set its own pace and rode toward home, carrying what she'd been given and what she'd earned and what she'd built out of the wreckage of loss. None of it perfect, all of it real, and the valley spread wide around her in the last